When I took a class and discovered a new passion, I never thought it would lead me down the darkest path of my life. It all started innocently enough. I was in my 30s, stuck in a dead-end job and living in a small apartment with creaky floors and a smelly fridge. My life was a monotonous cycle of work, eat, sleep, repeat. One day, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon an ad for a local community college offering a night class in creative writing. Writing had always been a hobby of mine, something I did on crumpled papers in coffee shops while combating the yawns induced by my uninspiring job. The thought of spending a few evenings surrounded by like-minded people ignited a spark of excitement in me. I signed up without hesitation. The first night of class arrived, and I walked into the dimly lit room, filled with mismatched chairs and the faint smell of old books. My instructor, an eccentric woman with wild gray hair and a penchant for dramatic pauses, introduced herself and gave us a brief overview of what to expect. As part of our first assignment, she asked us to write about an experience that changed us, and then we would share it with the class. I wrote about a summer I spent at my grandparents' old house, where I discovered a hidden attic filled with dusty trunks and forgotten memories. The words poured out of me as I remembered the thrill of exploring that space, the forbidden sense of adventure mixed with nostalgia as I unearthed old photographs and trinkets. When I shared my piece, the class was genuinely interested, nodding and smiling as I spoke. For the first time in years, I felt alive, valued, like I belonged. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into the assignments, pouring my heart into each piece. I experimented with short stories, poetry, and even horror, drawing from obscure inspirations that most wouldn't consider. Then one night, the instructor introduced a new idea: what if we wrote a story based on our fears? I relished the thought. I had been afraid of so many things: failure, loneliness, the unsettling feeling of being watched. I decided to explore something personal, a crippling fear I carried since childhood: the dark. Not the kind of dark where lights simply go out. No, this was deeper, an eldritch black that enveloped my mind in moments of anxiety. As I wrote, my fingers danced across the keys, weaving a tale where shadows come alive and devour the light. After sharing my piece, the room was silent. My classmates sat there, visibly unnerved, but somehow intrigued. The instructor, though she appeared slightly shaken, exclaimed that it was the most compelling work she had seen in years. That night propelled me into a frenzy of creativity. I became obsessed with the idea of fear and darkness, delving into research and writing nonstop. I started frequenting dusty libraries, indulging in tales of paranormal activity, urban legends, and the unexplained. I wanted to connect those threads. My stories now became infused with folklore and haunting mythology. It felt like I was awakening something dormant within me, a passion that sparked a fervor I couldn't control. My classmates were equally inspired, and we formed a close-knit group, sharing our writing and giving each other honest feedback. But something else began to happen. I started receiving dreams, vivid dreams that blurred the line between imagination and reality. In these dreams, I was often chased by twisted silhouettes, figures that felt so familiar and yet so utterly foreign. When I awoke, I'd jot them down, turning them into stories, refining my craft. After a particularly haunting dream one night, I wrote a story about a character who found an ancient book that whispers hidden secrets of the universe but at a terrible price. My peers were captivated, pushing me to submit it to a small online literary magazine. To my absolute shock, it got published. The adrenaline rush was intoxicating. Encouraged by this newfound success, I dedicated even more time to writing. It consumed me. Relationships suffered. I'd often shut myself in the apartment for days, neglecting hygiene and basic necessities in my obsession to craft the perfect story. There was something about that darkness emerging from my writing that felt almost too real, but I couldn't stop. It was exhilarating, almost euphoric. Each piece I wrote seemed to garner more darkness. One evening after a particularly harrowing class, I turned in early, craving solitude and silence. The ominous feeling settled heavily in my bones. Then, my phone rang. It was my instructor, her voice tremulous and echoing like it came from the depths of a cave. "We need to talk," she said. Tension prickled down my spine. I agreed to meet her. As I entered a nearby cafe, I noticed her sitting in the corner, hunched over a cup of coffee, an uncharacteristic frown plastered across her face. "I've been concerned," she admitted, glancing around the room as if the walls had ears. "Your writing. It's changed." It's becoming darker. Some people might say it's brilliant, but you need to be careful. What are you inviting into your life? I laughed, brushing her off. After all, I was just writing fiction. But that laugh echoed hollowly in my ears as I left the cafe. The feeling of being watched intensified. I began noticing shadows lurking out of the corners of my eyes, faceless shapes just beyond my vision that darted away whenever I tried to focus. It grew more intense, more frequent. Nights became terrifying, filled with whispers of doom and dread that turned my stomach. I brought it onto my writing, weaving these ominous feelings into stories about entities lurking in the dark, feeding off fear. The stories were well received, but the more they were published, the more my nightmares intensified. The turning point came one night when, exhausted and overwhelmed from writing, I awoke suddenly to darkness enveloping my entire room. It felt alive, pulsating, like it had a heartbeat. I propped myself on my elbows, the weight of the air almost suffocating as I noticed a figure in the shadows across from me. I convinced myself it was just sleep paralysis, refusing to accept that it was real. I turned my back to the apparition and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping for sleep's sweet embrace. My heart raced as the silence took on a chilling sound. The whispers returned, echoing dark promises and insidious truths. "You called us," they murmured, the voices twisted and layered like a devil's choir. The next morning, terrified, I reached out to one of my classmates. I needed someone to talk sense into me. But when I called, I learned they had disappeared into their own creative endeavors. No one had seen them in days. Panic surged through me as my heart sank. I needed to escape this madness. I decided to quit the class, hoping that leaving would shake this looming darkness away. I walked to the community college, trembling, my heart racing with every step. But when I arrived, I found the building eerily vacant, not a soul in sight. It was as if everyone had vanished. The only sign of life amid the emptiness was an old poster pinned to a wall, my name, alongside the names of my classmates, and a title, "The Darkness of Creation." I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a tsunami. I had written them into this existence, fed my fears, and now they were trapped, feeding the insatiable shadows I had invoked. With trembling hands, I ripped the poster from the wall and stumbled back into the night, desperate to escape. But as I turned to flee, the darkness followed me, and it whispered, "You'll join us soon." I fell into a dizzying spiral of paranoia and dread, writing furiously to make sense of what was happening. I started channeling the whirlwind of dark stories and dreams onto paper, but they fed the very things I feared. Friends I reached out to became haunted figures in my writing. It dawned on me that this class, this discovery of my passion, had consumed me, not in a way that empowered me but rather, like a parasite feeding off my essence. I ran from the class. I abandoned writing and cut ties with everyone, hoping that severing my connection would save me. But even now, I see those shadows lurking. They never really left, they creep into my sleep, my thoughts, even my daytime moments. What I discovered was not a newfound passion but a doorway that should have remained closed. So heed my warning, fellow dreamers, be cautious when pursuing your passions, for you might unearth something that was never meant to be found. I was your average 20-something, stuck in a rut and inundated with daily responsibilities that often felt suffocating. The grind of life had turned into a monotonous hum that blurred the beauty of existence into some kind of dull gray. I scrolled through social media daily, endlessly consuming images of idyllic lives that seemed so foreign, all the while feeling increasingly disconnected from my own reality. It was during one of those late-night scrolls that I stumbled across an article titled "The Power of Living in the Moment." The headline resonated, and I felt a little tug inside, an urge to break free from the confines of my routine. The stories of people who had abandoned their fears to embrace the spontaneous were intoxicating. I made a decision right then and there. I would live in the moment, no matter the cost. That next morning, I woke up with an almost reckless enthusiasm. I skipped breakfast to chase the sun rising on the horizon, feeling as if I was reclaiming a part of myself that had long been dormant. I drove aimlessly, music blasting, feeling freedom flood my veins. I ended up at a beach I had forgotten existed, the salty air wrapping around me like an old friend. I spent the day simply absorbing the beauty around me, the sound of the waves crashing, the laughter of children playing, the way the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. I took pictures, not for social media, but for me. I hadn't felt so alive in years. As the last rays of light dipped below the horizon, a gnawing feeling of anxiety crept in. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts and missed calls from worried friends, but I silenced it. If I was going to live in the moment, I had to commit. That night, I decided to do something truly impulsive. I headed to a bar I'd never been to before, where the atmosphere buzzed with a contagious energy. People were laughing and dancing, and I felt drawn in. I started chatting with a stranger, a woman with fiery red hair and an infectious laugh. We clicked instantly, trading stories and laughing as if we'd known each other forever. It felt exhilarating to connect with someone so randomly. As the night grew wilder, I convinced her to join me on a midnight drive up the coast. The wind whipped through the open windows, music blaring as we roared past moonlit beaches. I was living, I thought, like I had never lived before. But abruptly, the celebration turned sinister. We pulled over on the side of a secluded road to look at the stars. It seemed harmless enough, but as we stood there under the vast expanse, I felt a cold shiver slide down my spine. Suddenly, I heard whispers coming from the woods behind us, a woman's voice calling out softly. Chills coursed through my body as I turned to the girl beside me. Her expression had soured, a mix of fear and entrancement. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible against the night. I nodded hesitantly as the voice grew louder, her fascination overpowered by fear. It was a haunting melody, almost a song, calling to us. I felt compelled to investigate, and despite her protests, I found myself stepping toward the thicket. With each step, the whispers twisted into a melancholic lull, urging me to come closer. It wasn't long before I lost sight of the road, the darkness wrapping around me like a thick fog. I turned around to see the red-haired girl panic-stricken, but I felt drawn into the woods as if some unknown force was pulling me onward. The trees swayed, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for me. As I plunged deeper into the foliage, I noticed an eerie glow radiating from a small clearing ahead. The melody intensified, intertwining with the rustling of leaves, hypnotizing me. I stepped into the clearing, my breath hitching in my throat. The moonlight illuminated a circle of strange symbols etched into the earth. I was surrounded by silhouettes, figures dressed in tattered clothes, their faces obscured by shadows. I realized that these weren't just figures, they were the lost souls of those who had ventured into the woods before me. Their hollow eyes bore into my soul as they started to sway in rhythm with the haunting melody. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee back to safety, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers escalated, echoing in my mind, "Stay. Stay. Join us." I fought back, wriggling free until I burst through the trees and stumbled onto the road. The stars twinkled innocently overhead, and in the distance, I saw the red-haired girl standing there, worry painted across her delicate features. I rushed to her side, breathless and panicked. "We need to go. Now," I shouted, my voice raw with fear. As we scrambled into the car, I glanced back toward the woods, the shadows now still, as if they were watching us. I drove off in a haze of adrenaline, my mind racing. The thrill of adventure had come crashing down into a nightmarish realization. Living in the moment had brought me face to face with something I wasn't meant to find. As the sun began to rise, casting the world in warm hues, the exhilaration of last night faded, replaced by the weight of what I had almost lost. I had sought to escape from life's shackles, only to tango with the unknown. I vowed then and there that living in the moment didn't just mean throwing caution to the wind. It meant appreciating the beauty of each second with wisdom and awareness. Sure, I could find joy in spontaneity, but there were dangers in reckless abandon. When I returned home that day, weary and shaken but alive, I realized that true life is found not just in the wild, reckless moments but in the delicate balance of experience, understanding, and connection. The day I decided to live in the moment changed me forever, but not in the way I had expected. I learned the value of presence, not just through escapade, but through awareness of the shadows lurking just beyond the light. And though I still crave adventure, I approach each moment with reverence, knowing that sometimes, the most profound journeys happen within, and the real magic lies in the balance between embracing the thrill and recognizing the unknown. I never thought I'd be the one scrambling for the right words, especially not after my best friend, Alex, went through the most devastating breakup. It was a stupid fight. People always said that relationships crumbled over such trivial matters, but for Alex and Jenna, it felt like the end of the world, and when I got the call from Alex that night, my gut twisted. I sat there, staring at my phone, trying to muster enough courage to drop everything and drive over to his place. I arrived to find him in the dim light of his bedroom, sprawled out on his bed like a lost soul. The room was a chaotic reflection of his mind, clothes strewn everywhere, pizza boxes piling up, the remnants of a binge-watching night, and there he was, staring at the ceiling as if he could will the truth of the universe into existence. "I just don't understand why it had to end like this," he muttered, his voice heavy with hurt. I squeezed myself onto the bed beside him, no words at the tip of my tongue. I hated seeing him like this. He was always the strong one, the protector of the group. Watching him crumble was like losing a piece of myself. I reached out, a simple gesture, and after a moment, he turned to me, eyes glassy, haunted. "What do I do, man? I feel like I've lost everything." I took a deep breath, struggling to find the balance between empathy and the blunt truth. "You need to talk about it," I finally said. "But it hurts so much. I'm scared." I nodded, unsure of how to convince him when all I wanted was to pull him into an embracing promise of comfort. But caring for someone isn't always about comfort. Sometimes, it's about putting the pieces back together, however jagged. "So," I said, "let's just start. What happened?" Alex raked his hand through his hair, frustration radiating off him. "It was a stupid argument about social media. She wanted me to post more pictures of us, like I wasn't proud. And then it spiraled, and I said things I didn't mean." I could hear the regret in his voice. I knew how Jenna could be. Her passion for living life out loud didn't always mesh well with his quieter nature. "Have you even spoken to her since?" I pressed gently, hoping to prompt him to pull out the tangled mess with honesty. He shook his head slowly, as if the weight of the world was anchored to his thoughts. "I don't know what to say. What if she hates me?" I wanted to yell at him, to shake some sense into his insecurities. "Sometimes you have to face your fear, Alex. You can't run forever." His silence was deafening, but, like a wound that needed cleaning, it also felt necessary. Finally, Alex turned to me, eyes wide as if something clicked. "Should I call her? Even now?" "You have nothing to lose," I encouraged, trying to pull him from the abyss that was swallowing him whole. He took a deep breath, exhaled shakily, and grabbed his phone. I watched, heart racing, as he typed. The silence in the room was suffocating. Alex's thumb hovered over the send button, hovering in that moment like a tightrope walker balancing between fear and bravery. But then, it happened. The screen lit up with 3 little dots. Jenna was responding. A part of me wanted to snatch the phone and read what she wrote, to pry open the wound and force him to confront whatever emotional shadows loomed over them. I struggled against that urge because this was his journey, not mine. I simply sat, tapping at my own leg, trying not to explode with the anticipation that pulsed in the air. All the while, I tried to picture Jenna's home life, the anxious glances exchanged over dinner, the way her laughter filled a room but could vanish in an instant when insecurities crossed her mind. Okay. She's willing to talk. She wants to meet up. Fear flashed across Alex's face, and I felt the momentum of the moment shift. What happens now? I felt the weight of the question. He was asking for more than just the next step. He was asking for guidance, a lifeline to navigate the storm. "You tell her how you feel. No games. No hiding." Just as the words left my mouth, the sound of nails scratching against wood made me freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, like tiny whispers from the other side of my mind. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the paranoia that crept in, something dark and heavy, lurking in the corners of my awareness. What if she doesn't feel the same? What if we can't go back? Alex's voice fractured like glass, and for a moment, that eerie scratching sound grew louder, more insistent. "Then you'll deal with it. But don't let your fear of the outcome suffocate you. Don't let this become another ghost." We rounded a corner, both lost somewhere between the pain of a breakup and the glimmer of hope lingering in the shadows. Alex stood, transforming moments from darkness to light, ready to face the most vulnerable part of himself, ready to confront Jenna, whatever might come. Just as he grabbed his keys and storms out, that scratching sound escalated to a whisper, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a chill creep across my back. "Alex, wait." I called, and he turned back, both confused and hesitant. "Are you sure about this?" My voice quavered with unease, but he nodded, determination etched in the lines of his face. "I need to do this. I watched him walk away, the tension of his resolve crackling in the air, almost palpable. But just as I turned to close the door, I couldn't shake the feeling. What was that scratching? I felt an overwhelming urge to investigate the source. I crept through the darkened house, listening closely until I found it, the sound emitted from the attic above. It seemed to pound against the silence, a deliberate rhythm echoing in my ears. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart thumping louder with every creak of the stairs. I climbed up against instincts that screamed at me to turn back. As I swung open the attic door, the beam of light illuminated the space, revealing cobwebs and old boxes. But then, I spotted something. A figure crouched in the corner, half hidden in shadows, scratching a pattern that seemed hypnotic, eerily methodical. My stomach dropped. "Who are you?" My voice broke the tense stillness, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face wooden and distorted. A smile stretched across cracked lips, but there was no warmth, only an echoing void. "You were not meant to discover this," it rasped. Panic surged through me, as something instinctive urged me to turn away, to bolt back down those stairs and forget this nightmare. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Stay away from me." I managed to scream, and in a burst of adrenaline, I turned and fled, stumbling back into my own reality, my senses screaming. I slammed the attic door shut behind me, chained by the fear that had just taken root in my mind. It was as if my body had awakened from a deep sleep, and I found myself wishing I could have back that simple moment with Alex, before everything had spun into the surreal, away from the comfort of friendship, caught in a damn horror. The truth is, some conversations are tougher than others, but the hardest part is confronting the darkness that sometimes lurks right beside you, just waiting to tear you apart. As I stood there, I knew, it wasn't just Alex facing the shadows, it was me, too. The day I realized the importance of self-reflection started like any other, with my alarm clock aggressively buzzing at 6 a.m. I hit snooze, rolled over, and returned to the comfort of sleep. Little did I know, this would be the day my life changed forever. I finally dragged myself out of bed around 7:15, groggy and disoriented. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashed some water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The tired eyes staring back at me didn't reveal any hint of the strange events that were about to unfold. It was just an ordinary Thursday and, like most, I was preoccupied with my usual routine. I downed a cup of coffee, checked my phone, which was filled with notifications from social media. I mindlessly scrolled through the feed, absorbing the curated happiness of my friends and strangers alike. As I got dressed, I thought about how I'd been feeling off lately, a persistent cloud of anxiety hanging over me, overshadowed by a gnawing sense that I was missing something crucial in my life. Work was a blur, as it often was. I sat at my desk, filtering through emails, when I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Meet me at the park after work. You need to see this." My anxiety spiked at the unknown message, and my thoughts raced. Was it some well-meaning friend trying to help? Or something more sinister? Curiosity pushed me to keep the appointment. After a long, grueling day, I made my way to the park, a place that was usually filled with laughter and life but now felt heavy and ominous in the evening gloom. The air was thick with an impending storm. I scanned the area, spotting a figure in the distance, cloaked in shadow. As I got closer, I realized it was an old friend from high school, Sam, someone I had lost touch with over the years. He looked just as I remembered, except for the haunted look in his eyes that sent a chilling shiver down my spine. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice shaky. "I know this is weird, but I wouldn't have reached out if it wasn't important." I felt a knot tighten in my gut. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. Without a word, he handed me a small, ornate mirror that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. "I need you to look into it," Sam urged. "It's not just any mirror, it shows the truth of who you really are." I hesitated, staring at the reflective surface that looked too beautiful to belong in this park, too polished for the mundane reality surrounding us. In a moment of reluctant bravery, or stupidity, I took the mirror in my hands, feeling its cold weight. Looking into it, I expected to see my tired reflection, maybe even the anxiety scars etched upon my face. What I saw, however, was a horrifying distortion of my life's choices laid bare before me, all my regrets, my failures, and the people I'd hurt. Flashes of moments I'd buried deep appeared, my friend Miranda crying as I rejected her ideas, the way I had tossed aside my family when they needed me most, and the countless missed opportunities in my quest for superficial success. I stumbled back, gasping for air, the weight of it crushing me. Sam looked stricken, but also relieved, as if he had been waiting for this moment. You see it now, don't you? The mirror forces you to confront yourself, to face your past. Too many people refuse to look, he said. I dropped the mirror to the grass, feeling sick. What does this even mean? Why show me this? Because, he replied softly, we can't move forward until we understand where we've been. His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I realized my life had been on autopilot. I had avoided self-reflection, comfortable in my ignorance, refusing to accept the cracks in my facade. We sat in silence as the clouds rolled in, a storm on the horizon matching the turmoil in my heart. Thunder rumbled, and with it came a storm of another kind. Memories flooded my mind, drowning me in the weight of guilt and regret. I thought of the people I had pushed away and the friendships I'd neglected out of selfishness. For the first time, I felt the hollowness of my existence, and it scared me. It feels overwhelming, doesn't it? Sam said, his voice penetrating my spiral. But the important part is recognizing it. We can change if we allow ourselves to feel, to grow. Self-reflection isn't about punishment, it's about understanding. I had never thought of it that way. Underneath the anger I had felt for him reappearing in my life, there was a small flicker of hope. I wanted to make amends, to reach out to those I had wronged, to revive the missed opportunities. In that moment, something shifted within me, and I realized that acknowledging my faults was the first step toward healing. The first raindrops began to fall, patting against the ground, matching the rhythm of my heart. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the growing storm. I needed this. Sam smiled, and for the first time, I felt a connection, a shared understanding. We got up, leaving the mirror behind, and started walking away from the park, as the sky opened up and unleashed a torrent of rain. As the storm washed over us, I felt something else begin to wash away, the fear of facing myself. The downpour mirrored the flood of feelings I had suppressed for so long. That day became a turning point in my life, a day of realization that self-reflection, uncomfortable as it might be, was vital for growth. Months have passed since then, and I've spent every moment striving to reconnect with the people I hurt, rebuilding friendships, and forging new paths. I finally prioritized self-care, taking the time to reflect on my choices and confront my inner fears. Now, as I watch the world spin outside my window, the rain has become a comfort. It's a reminder that embracing discomfort can lead to clarity and transformation. So, next time you look at your reflection, ask yourself what truly lies beneath. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters are the ones we hide within ourselves. Ignore them at your own peril. I wasn't prepared for that day. You know, sometimes life leads you down a path you never wanted to travel, and on the day I had to say goodbye, I realized just how little control I had over my life. It started like any other day. Late in the afternoon, while the golden sun seemed to melt into the horizon, casting a warm glow over everything, I was sitting on my bed, browsing through social media, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside my window. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister, Sarah, asking if I could come over to help her with a project for college. Sarah, as usual, left the details vague, and before I could even question her, I tossed on a hoodie and made my way to her apartment, only 2 blocks away. As I walked, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The sky was a swirling gray, threatening rain. The whole world felt heavy, almost subdued. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the impending storm, while the cold wind whispered secrets in my ear. Arriving at Sarah's place, I found the door slightly ajar, which was unusual. The apartment was typically locked tight. With a hesitant push, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit living room cluttered with textbooks, art supplies, and the remnants of takeout containers. Sarah. I called out, hoping to hear her familiar voice, but all I got in return was silence. It was eerie, an unsettling quiet that crept under my skin. I stepped in, closing the door gently behind me. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, and that's when I noticed a notebook lying open on the coffee table, pages scattered as if in a hurry. Something compelled me to approach it, and as I began to read, I realized it was filled with drawings, strange, haunting images that sent a chill through my bones. There were sketches of an old, decrepit house, entangled in vines, and at the bottom of one page, a note scrawled in shaky handwriting, "It's time to let go, Sarah." My heart raced. I glanced around the room, and that's when I noticed a shimmery light coming from the bedroom. A fleeting thought cautioned me to leave, but instead, curiosity won. I tiptoed down the narrow hallway, the floor creaking ominously underfoot, and pushed the bedroom door open. The sight that greeted me was surreal. Sarah was sitting on the bed, enveloped in a pale glow, staring at an old family photo, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Hey," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She glanced up, her eyes red and puffy. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered, voice trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling a mix of concern and confusion. She gestured toward the window, which overlooked a backyard filled with towering trees swaying gently in the wind. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom. And the house." I froze. Mom had passed away a few years back, and the old family house had stood empty since then, a testament to memories better left undisturbed. "We can't go back there, Sarah. It's too painful." But there was a wild determination in her eyes. "No, listen. I've been having these dreams. About the house. I feel like there's something we need to uncover." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, casting ominous shadows across the room. "Did you see that?" she exclaimed. I felt an icy grip on my spine. Then, suddenly, the ground shook, rattling the windows, and I stumbled back, clutching the doorframe for support. "We have to go," I urged, panic rising in my throat. "Not until we confront this," she insisted, wiping her tears and standing resolute. Against my better judgment, I found myself swept up in her fervor. We gathered a few things, a flashlight, some old photos, and the notebook she had been drawing in, and headed out into the brewing storm, determined to face whatever awaited us at the old house. The rain began to pelt down, drenching us as we walked to the site of so many bittersweet memories. The house loomed before us, an ancient sentinel of loss and love, its dilapidated frame cloaked in darkness. Each step closer felt like walking into the mouth of a beast. The creaking door protested as we stepped inside, and the smell of damp wood and mold hit us like a wall. "It's just like I remembered," Sarah murmured, her voice distant, as if she were searching for something deeper. We made our way to the living room, where the memories flooded back like a tidal wave. Laughing family dinners, holiday celebrations, and soft whispers of bedtime stories echoed in my mind. I felt the weight of nostalgia mixed with a surge of grief. "We should look in her old bedroom," I suggested, hoping to find comfort among her things. Sarah nodded, and we ascended the stairs, the wood creaking under our weight. The bedroom door stood partially open, and I pushed it wide, flooding the room with our flashlight's beam. It was just as we had left it, dusty, untouched, but on the bed lay a box marked "Memories." My heart quickened. We opened it together, revealing a collection of old letters, pictures, and trinkets. As we sifted through the items, I stumbled upon a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, and my breath caught in my throat. Sarah shuddered beside me. "It's hers," she whispered, voice trembling with emotion. Just then, we heard a sound, a soft whisper echoing through the room. I turned to see a shadow shift in the corner, and my stomach dropped. "Did you hear that?" I gasped, but Sarah was already stepping closer to the shadows. "Mom!" she called, eerily calm. I tugged at her arm, but it was too late. The air grew colder, and the shadow morphed into a familiar figure, my mother, looking just as she had before her passing, radiant yet sorrowful. "Sarah, you have to let go," she spoke, her voice a calm lull, wrapping us in warmth, yet frigid in its implications. "You can't hold on to the past forever." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she took a step forward. "But I miss you, I need you," she cried, her voice breaking. "You're still here," Mom said, her expression filled with love and sadness. "In every memory, in every heartbeat, but sometimes, you must let the past rest to truly live." I felt a wave of emotion as I watched their interaction unfold, understanding that this was a goodbye unlike any other. "Let the house go, Sarah," I urged softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's time." The shadow of our mother nodded, urging her forward. "You will find me in your heart," she whispered, the glow surrounding her shimmering as if she were made out of starlight. "It's time to say goodbye." The room filled with an ethereal light, and I took Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. I love you, Sarah cried, her voice breaking as she grasped the edges of her memories. The light grew brighter, enveloping the room, and for a moment, I was blinded. When the light receded, we stood alone. The shadow was gone, leaving a sense of eerie peace. We looked at each other, tears streaming down our faces, but somehow, there was a glimpse of relief. We need to leave, I said, voice trembling. Together. As we stepped out of that house, the storm outside seemed to lessen. The weight that had clung to our hearts lightened. It was bittersweet. As we exited the remnants of our past, we made peace with what we had to let go. Sometimes, saying goodbye is the first step toward healing. Under the heavy clouds, we walked hand in hand, ready to embrace the future with the love and memories our mother had left us, no longer shackled by the shadows of the past. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I need to share this story because it changed the course of my life in ways I never expected. It started on a rainy Saturday afternoon when I stumbled upon an old, dusty bookstore that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. The kind of place where you could smell the pages and the history wafting through the air. I stepped in, the creaky door announcing my entrance like an unwelcome guest. As I wandered through the aisles, I felt drawn to a particular section, one that I usually wouldn't pay much attention to. It was the occult and horror section. Most of the titles were predictable, but one caught my eye, a nondescript, tattered book with no author listed, just a spine that seemed to shimmer faintly under the dim light. I picked it up, feeling an unsettling chill creep along my skin, but curiosity took over. I wanted to know what secrets this book held. I flipped through the pages, and strange illustrations filled with grotesque imagery jumped out at me. It felt alive, almost as if it was beckoning me to delve deeper. I decided to buy it, against my better judgment, thinking it would be an interesting conversation piece more than anything. That night, I sank into my couch, cup of tea in hand, and started reading. The first few pages were a mixture of obscure knowledge about ancient rituals and cryptic poetry, but as I continued, it morphed into something more unsettling. Each page seemed to call out to me, whispering promises of knowledge and power, or perhaps danger. I found myself unable to put it down despite the gnawing sense of dread that settled in my stomach. As the clock ticked past midnight, I reached a passage that seemed to come alive. It spoke of a ritual, a simple incantation that had the power to manifest one's deepest desires. I knew it was nonsense, but the idea was tantalizing, the possibility of having anything I wanted. Driven by impulse, I gathered the items the book recommended, a candle, a mirror, and a small sliver of my own hair. I felt ridiculous, but I convinced myself it was just a harmless experiment. Once I set everything up, I began to recite the words from the book. A strange wind swirled through my living room, extinguishing the candle in an instant. I halted mid-sentence, dread crawling up my spine. But something pushed me to continue. I whispered the words again, a sense of urgency filling my voice. As if responding to my plea, the mirror began to ripple like water, distorting my reflection. Suddenly, the world around me went black. I panicked, feeling disoriented and trapped in some void. And then I was thrown back into my living room. Shaken, I stared at the mirror, which now gleamed with an unsettling light. It was then that I noticed something in the reflection, a shadowy figure just behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the wind howling outside like the harbinger of something terrible. I decided to ignore it, assuming it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. The following days, however, were not as I had hoped. At first, small things changed, a promotion at work, unexpected good weather, even an old friend who had ghosted me reached out. It felt like the ritual was working, and I was riding on a high, believing I had done something extraordinary. But then came the price. Each day, a deeper sense of anxiety crept in, like a shadow slowly consuming the vibrant colors of my life. I found myself hearing whispers at night, soft, sinister murmurs that echoed through the walls. I convinced myself I was merely stressed, but within a week, bizarre things began to happen. Animals would follow me, their eyes wide and frantic. I would see fleeting glimpses of the figure I had seen in the mirror, lurking just out of sight. And then one night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices calling my name. I bolted upright, fear gripping my heart, and as I glanced at the mirror, I felt a chilling realization. The shape had formed into something unmistakable, my own face but twisted, contorted into a grotesque smile. I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to confront it, to take everything back. Armed with the knowledge I'd acquired from the book, I prepared another ritual, one that the text hinted at as a cleansing ceremony. I lit the candle and faced the mirror, chanting the words I fervently hoped would undo my mistake. The air grew heavy, humming with energy, and as I finished, I saw the figure reappear, just behind me, reaching out as if trying to drag me in. Panic surged within me, but I had to remain steadfast. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, my voice trembling. The shadows swirled around me, battling against the light from the candle. For a moment, it felt as if everything was suspended in time, the light and dark clashing violently as I stood frozen before the mirror. And then, in a blinding flash, everything went quiet. I blinked and found myself staring at my own reflection, unharmed, the room eerily calm. Believing I was finally free, I turned away and put the book back on the shelf. But just as the tension began to ease, something unexpected caught my eye. My own reflection was still smiling that twisted smile, buried underneath my image. It stared back at me with eyes filled with gleeful malice. For weeks after, I felt its presence lurking, each moment heavy with the weight of what I had unleashed. My life became a hellscape, filled with distorted reflections and whispers that never let me rest. I finally had to face the truth: some books should remain closed, their knowledge left untouched. And though I returned to that bookstore to warn the owner about the cursed tome, to my utter horror, it had vanished into the ether, absorbed into the very shadows it had conjured. It's been months since that fateful night, and now I live in constant fear, forever glancing into mirrors, terrified that one day that twisted smile will break free, dragging me back into the darkness as it rises to take my place and fulfill its own hungry desires. So, please, if you ever come across a book that calls to you with a whisper or a fleeting shimmer, think twice before you open it. You never know what might be lurking just behind the pages, or within your own reflection. I live in a quiet little town where everyone knows everyone else's business, and most of the time, that's just fine by me. But about 3 months ago, I found myself facing a challenge that turned everything upside down. It started on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when the sun was setting, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement of my street. I had just returned from my mundane job at the local library, where I spend my days helping kids find books and organizing dusty old encyclopedias that nobody ever reads. On that day, I had plans to settle on my couch with a steaming cup of chamomile tea and the latest thriller. Little did I know that my evening was about to be hijacked by something otherworldly and unfathomable. As I was about to step into my humble abode, I noticed a peculiar shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off a blacktop road on a scorching summer day. It swirled and twisted, and my heart raced as I approached it, an inexplicable pull urging me closer. The moment I reached what felt like the edge of another dimension, I froze as I saw flickering images emerge from the shimmer, flashes of events that hadn't happened yet. I saw myself talking to my boss, her face twisted in fury. I saw myself missing a crucial meeting. I saw a car crash. I couldn't catch my breath, overwhelmed by the weight of possibilities bombarding my mind. And just as quickly as it started, the shimmer faded, leaving me confused and shaken. I dismissed it as an elaborate daydream brought on by exhaustion, yet something deep in my gut warned me it was more than that. The next day, my boss did seem unusually cold when I spoke to her, but I shrugged it off. I went on with my life, but the following days turned out to be a whirlwind of dread and concern. That week, my friend Sarah called to tell me something awful had happened. Her brother had been in a bad car accident. The very scene I had seen in the shimmer played over and over in my mind, and I was overtaken by panic. I had to find a way to prevent all this from happening. The more I tried to ignore the images, the more specific and grotesque they became: an elderly woman collapsing in the grocery store, a child lost in the park, and I even envisioned the very library I worked in burning down to the ground. It spiraled. I started obsessively planning out my days, trying to outsmart fate. I offered help to old ladies struggling with their groceries, made sure to call my boss every morning to check in, and kept track of every child that entered the library. Logic twisted into paranoia. I would stay up late reading DIY fire extinguisher manuals, and my social life slipped away entirely. Friends stopped inviting me to gatherings. They said I was acting weird. But I couldn't let anything happen on my watch. Then came the night that changed everything, the night the shimmer returned. I was in the bathroom washing my hands when it appeared again, even stronger this time, flooding the room with a dizzying light. I gazed into the shimmer until I saw, with crystal clarity, the worst scenario yet, a vision of myself, hands shaking, frozen in the library as the fire roared behind me. I gasped, realizing I was just about to witness another potential tragedy destined to unfold. But instead of running away or trying to cover my eyes, something beyond my control gripped me, compelling me to stay and observe. My breath caught in my throat as the scene played out, but it wasn't just a vision. The fire erupted out of thin air, hot and ferocious. I could hear the crackle of flames, feel the heat washing over me, and suddenly, I was dropped right into the middle of the nightmare. I couldn't believe it. I was standing in my own library, right in front of the blaze. There were children inside, panicked and scared. I held a fire extinguisher, but my hands trembled, and I could feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I was paralyzed. Just when I thought I might succumb to terror, I heard a child's voice, a little boy who had wandered too far from his mother. "Help me," he cried out, and in that horrifying split second, the shimmer and the visions faded, but the urgency remained. That plea snapped something deep inside me. I burst into action, rushing toward the boy, and everything felt surreal. My fear transformed into focus, and I could almost hear a voice telling me to move with grace, to channel my inner strength. I guided the child through the smoke, leading him out the emergency exit into the cool, fresh air. The other kids followed, and as we reached safety, the fire department had just arrived, extinguishing the blaze that could have taken more than just books. As I stood there, panting and soaked in adrenaline, I could hardly believe what just happened. The shimmer returned one last time, wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. It whispered softly, an echo of the future that I had rewritten. I faced that unexpected challenge not with fear, but with grace. The experience redefined courage for me. It showed me that sometimes, the things we fear most can turn into moments of profound strength and clarity. I returned home that night exhausted but free from the grip of paranoia that had clouded my life. Every day since, I've been carrying the lesson I learned. I now embrace the uncertain future with open arms, trusting that no matter what challenges may come, I have the ability to face them head-on, with a spirit of grace that I never knew I possessed. So if you ever catch a glimpse of shimmering air or feel some unexplainable pull, take a moment, remember my story, and don't be afraid to step into the unknown. You never know what kind of strength lies dormant within you, waiting for the moment to awaken. I used to think forgiveness was simple, a kind gesture people offered when they felt wronged. I never imagined it could feel like an insurmountable mountain, especially when the pain cuts deep, like it did for me. I had spent years hating the person who hurt me, convinced that holding on to that anger was the only way to honor what had been lost. It was late October, just as the leaves began to change and the nights grew longer, when everything began to unravel. It started with a letter sliding through my mailbox, an unexpected correspondence that ignited memories I had tried to bury. The handwriting was familiar, that precise, looping script that belonged to my sister, Lily. A year had passed since I last heard from her, the day she walked out of my life after an explosive argument I could hardly remember now. She wrote about wanting to reconnect, about how she still thought of our childhood, of our laughter echoing through the halls of our home, the way we used to sneak into the kitchen late at night to devour leftovers. But most importantly, she admitted to making a grave mistake, a secret she had harbored all these years. Curiosity gnawed at me, an unsettling mix of longing and dread, compelling me to call her. At first, I hesitated, fingers trembling over my phone screen, but with a quick breath, I dialed her number. When she picked up, her voice was like a distant echo, warm yet strained with unspoken guilt. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her words tumbling out like pebbles. "The day everything broke apart, it was my fault. I was the one who..." My heart raced as she confessed the truth that changed my life forever. She had been involved in the accident that took our mother's life. I was blindsided, drowning in a mixture of anger and grief. For a year, I had blamed the driver, the chaotic circumstances, the universe for its cruelty, but here lay the reality. My sister, my confidant, had been behind the wheel that night. I choked back the wave of emotions, wanting to scream at her for the wreckage she had caused but also wanting to understand, to know what drove her that night. But as she spoke, tears pouring from her voice, I felt the foundations of my rage begin to tremble. She cried out how she had been drinking, how she hadn't meant to pull onto that road that led to a fatal twist of fate. I listened, on the verge of crumbling, my heart aching for the little girl who once stood beside me, laughing, dreaming of our future together. As her confession came to an end, I could see how she felt trapped in a prison of her own making, and I realized something remarkable: she was as broken as I was. A few days passed, and we met at a small cafe that overlooked a quiet park. The golden autumn leaves fell gently around us, the air crisp, as if it mirrored the fragile state of our hearts. We sat across from one another, neither of us knowing how to break the tension. I noticed the way the sunlight caught in her hair, how her eyes were rimmed with fatigue and regret. After some silence, she clutched her mug tightly and spoke, "I can't change what happened, but I want to make it right. I want to help us heal." Her sincerity hit me like an icy wave, and for the first time in so long, I felt my animosity fade just a little. Underneath the weight of our shared past lay a sliver of hope, delicate yet persistent. So, I opened up too. I told her how I felt fractured beneath the weight of resentment, how I spent countless sleepless nights imagining a different outcome. We laid bare our hearts, each confession weaving us closer together, mending the jagged edges of our souls. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, we built a bridge out of our shared pain. It wasn't easy, every moment felt like a negotiation with my conscience. I needed to let go of the darkness before it consumed me. Lily showed me the depths of her remorse, attending support groups, volunteering at shelters, and finding ways to honor our mother's memory by helping others. I began to see the woman before me not as the architect of my sorrow but as an embodiment of resilience. Together, we began to remember happier times, the adventures we had, the lessons our parents taught us, and the warmth of family. However, as we continued on this path toward reconciliation, I found myself haunted by dreams that turned sinister. Nightmares would grasp me in their icy fingers, dark scenarios where the car accident rewound, where my mother flashed her last smile, only for me to watch her life fade away, trapped in a time loop. Each time, I awoke soaked in sweat, heart racing, clenching my fists in frustration. I couldn't escape the specter of that night. Yet, in the haze of those dreams, a truth emerged. Clinging to my anger felt like a shackle, binding me to the past. I wanted freedom. And so, I sought out a therapist, hoping to sort through the chaos. Dr. Hargrove was patient and wise, guiding me through the emotional labyrinth, teaching me to confront my feelings without fear. With every session, I released fragments of my anguish, exploring various pathways of grief and acceptance. I learned that forgiveness wasn't a clean break but rather a tumultuous journey of self-discovery. Each week brought with it new revelations, but the most significant breakthrough happened during a particularly grueling session. I realized that forgiveness was not absolution, it was granting myself permission to move forward. It was acknowledging the hurt without letting it define me. I stood up one day, fueled by a newfound clarity, and told Lily I wanted to visit the site where our lives had changed forever. She was hesitant but followed my lead, and together we approached the place where our nightmare began. The road was quieter than I remembered, surrounded by trees that towered like sentinels. I knelt down, the earth cool beneath my fingers, and breathed deeply, coaxing out the choking grief. I spoke aloud to my mother, pouring out everything I had held inside: love, loss, anger, regret. I asked for forgiveness, not just for Lily but for myself. In that moment, a wave of relief washed over me, a feeling of lightness, like lifting a heavy veil. When I finally stood up, I turned to face Lily. Tears glistened in her eyes, and we embraced as if we were both shedding heavy cloaks. The journey toward forgiveness wasn't over, but I felt the chains that had once bound us to the past begin to disintegrate. We decided my mother's birthday would become a day of remembrance, a day to honor the love she had given us instead of focusing solely on the way we lost her. As the years passed, I found healing through tiny acts of kindness, through laughter and remembrance, through understanding the dark entwined with the light. I learned that our scars could tell a richer story than the pain itself. Forgiveness, I discovered, was not the end of my journey but the beginning, a new chapter that lay ahead, and though I still carried the weight of loss, it no longer defined me. Instead, it was a gentle reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. So here I am, sitting in front of my computer, sharing this story, hoping it resonates with those lost in their pain. If you ever find yourself wandering in darkness, remember, the journey of forgiveness is not a solitary road. It can lead you to places of unimaginable healing, where the shadows recede and the warmth of connection lights the path forward. I've always been the kind of person who finds comfort in routine, so when something jolted me out of my norm, I didn't handle it well. It started last fall, an ordinary October morning, when I discovered I had an empty house. My mother passed away unexpectedly, and I was left alone in the world. Yes, I had friends, my work, and the distractions that come with being an adult, but with her gone, I felt sharply the absence of guidance, love, and support. Somehow, the house felt haunted, filled with whispers of memories that now echoed only to mock me. I'll admit, I tried to avoid the overwhelming grief with a slew of distractions, which only led to guilt piled atop sorrow. One evening, during a particularly vivid wave of melancholy, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the basement. I was looking for something to keep me busy. The basement had always been a place of mystery, filled with boxes of my mother's life, dusty furniture, and a faint, musty smell that teased at forgotten stories. As I rummaged through stacks of cardboard boxes marked keep or toss, something caught my eye. There was an old, unmarked box buried beneath the rest. It had no label, just layers of dust. Out of curiosity, I pulled it out, and as I opened it, I found a collection of old journals, each one yellowed and fragile. There was a strange sense of reverence as I handled them. It felt like I was touching a part of her that was preserved, something I would have plunged into if I hadn't been so afraid of what I might find. The first journal was filled with entries from her teenage years, detailing crushes, friendships, and dreams, a world where I could see glimpses of her before I ever existed, a time when she forged her identity independent of her role as a mother. I felt both exhilarated and devastated as I flipped through, each word pulling me deeper into the nostalgia of a life I was now disconnected from. I spent hours lost in her thoughts, laughing at her awkward drawings and crying at the raw energy in her words. However, it wasn't the light-hearted moments that struck me, it was the darker entries that tugged the most at my heartstrings, the discussions of her struggles with self-worth, anxiety, and moments of despair. Each page painted a picture of someone not so different from me. The realization hit as I read, she had faced her own demons and stumbled but always found a way to stand back up. I needed to honor that sense of resilience, to keep her spirit alive in my heart instead of choosing to drown in sadness. As the weeks went by, I immersed myself in the journals. They became a lifeline during my darkest moments. Each entry inspired me to confront my grief, urging me to pull myself out of the abyss. One night, after reading about her creative passions, from painting to writing, it dawned on me that I had my own creative outlets I'd abandoned over the years. So, I made a decision. I would channel my energy into creating something for her, something that reflected her spirit and encouraged others who might be lost, just as I was. I bought a canvas and began painting. Sitting there, brush in hand, I struggled at first. The type of anxiety my mother often wrote about crept back in, whispering doubts that stung like vinegar. I was convinced I was incapable of doing anything worthwhile. Yet, with each stroke, a cathartic release undid the knots tied inside me. As colors swirled and shapes took form, I let go of the perfect image I had in my mind. Instead, I embraced the chaotic beauty that happened when I allowed myself to feel. The act of creating was awkward yet liberating, and I found solace in the process, an echo of my mother's own journeys into art that she sometimes documented in her journals. That night turned into many more, and as weeks passed, my easel became a source of healing. I painted a series of pieces that expressed my grief, my fear, and ultimately, my hope. They were a tribute to my mother and a reflection of the strength found in vulnerability. Each creation revealed layers of me I had long buried beneath mundane routines of life. Together, they told a story not just of loss but of the emergence of a new self, the child learning to walk without the guiding hand of its parent. When I finally felt ready, I decided to capture my journey in a blog, sharing my mother's stories alongside my own. I wanted people to know they weren't alone in their struggles. The first post went live on a chilly December evening, my heart racing as I hit publish. The blog gained traction, and what began as a simple personal project morphed into a vibrant community of individuals sharing their own stories of grief and resilience. The comments poured in, messages of gratitude, confessions of their own battles, and stories of triumph. People thanked me for being vulnerable, for showing them that it was okay to fall apart and rebuild. It was everything I had hoped for and more. The feeling of helping others began softening the sharp edges of my own pain. And then something unexpected happened. I was invited to speak at a community event about mental health and the importance of sharing our stories. Back then, I might have rejected the idea, shy and overwhelmed, but instead, I found myself accepting with a mix of terror and excitement. With each passing day leading up to the event, I tapped into the strength that my mother had shown me, the same strength that had come through in her journals. I wrote out my speech, intertwining her words with my narrative. Finally, the night came, and as I stood before a crowd, my hands shaking, I took a deep breath and began to speak. The words poured out, the stories flowed, and for the first time, I felt a sense of empowerment. Each person in that room became a part of my journey, a vital piece of a larger tapestry. After sharing my story, I saw people in the audience nodding, reaching for tissues, some even whispering their own truths as the gravity of connection settled in the air. That night, something changed in me. I realized that overcoming my personal challenge wasn't just a solitary journey, but a communal experience. My mother's legacy continued through me, connecting us all in a shared struggle. As I left the venue, a woman approached me, tears in her eyes. She thanked me for sharing my story, recounting her own struggles with grief and loss, and how my words encouraged her to embrace her past instead of running from it. I hugged her, feeling the heat of our collective pain, and in that moment, I knew I had transformed my grief into a strength that not only served me but offered hope to others. Now, every October rolls around, and I honor my mother's memory differently. I host a small gathering each year, with art, stories, and shared laughter. We celebrate not just loss, but resilience, proving that we can emerge stronger through our struggles, and that the chains of grief can forge new beginnings. I learned to confront my demons head-on and to never shy away from the uncomfortable truths. So, if you ever find yourself overwhelmed by darkness, remember, there's a light within the stories we carry, and strength lies in embracing our vulnerabilities. Every challenge faced is a step toward deeper connections, both with ourselves and with others. Like the journals I discovered, our experiences may hold the keys to transforming pain into purpose, so share your story. You never know who will find strength in your words. I never thought my journey to setting healthy boundaries would lead me to a horrifying realization about myself. It all started innocently enough. I was a people pleaser, always the one to jump at the chance to help friends and family, even when it meant sacrificing my own happiness. I thought being nice would earn me their love and approval. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, that facade began to crack. I was drained, both emotionally and physically. My friend Jessica would call me at all hours with her relationship problems. I'd listen patiently, offering advice, accepting her tears and tantrums as if they were mine to bear. Her drama became my routine, a daily prescription for agony disguised as friendship. Then there was Dave, my coworker, whose workload I had taken on as my own. Sure, my boss praised me for my initiative, but deep down, I was suffocating under the weight of his responsibilities. And that's when the nightmares started. At first, they felt like mere reflections of my stress, fragments of my chaotic life. I would wake from dreams where I was drowning in oceans of obligation, hands clutching at my throat, eyes wide with fear. But as the weeks passed, the nightmares became visceral, bleeding into my waking life. I remember one particular night. In my dream, I stood in a vast, black void, my limbs tangled in thick, glistening vines. They wrapped around my body, squeezing tighter with each plea for help escaping my lips. And just as I thought there was no escape, a voice boomed in the darkness, "You made this mess. No one is coming for you." I jolted awake, gasping for breath, my heart racing. It was then I realized something needed to change. The next day, I summoned every ounce of courage I had and made a decision: I would start setting boundaries. I drafted a message to Jessica, explaining that I couldn't be her emotional crutch anymore. As I hit send, I felt a mix of dread and relief. When she replied with anger and sarcasm, claiming I was abandoning her, a chill ran down my spine. But I held my ground, hoping that the universe would reward my newfound strength. Shortly after, I faced Dave. I had a meeting scheduled with my boss, intending to reclaim my workload and let Dave handle his own. For the first time, I felt like a warrior stepping into battle. I envisioned myself marching into the room, ready to demand respect and equality. But the moment I opened my mouth, the fear cloaked me like an icy shroud. My knees felt weak, and I almost crumbled under the pressures of my perfectionism. Yet, as I attempted to address my concerns, it all morphed into a garbled mess of words. When I walked out of that meeting, the weight around my chest felt heavier than before. I started doubting myself, worrying that I would lose everything: my friends, my job, my identity. Then the nightmares returned, more vivid and sinister than ever. I lay in bed, drenched in sweat, as the voice from the darkness began to whisper in my ear, taunting me, "You're doing it wrong. They will all leave you." I tried to shake it off, thinking I could ignore it. After all, I had made progress, right? But with each nightmare that slithered into my slumber, I became haunted by unrelenting guilt. One night, I dreamt about a grotesque version of Jessica. Her face twisted, her eyes dark, accusing me of abandoning her in her time of need. She dragged me through her chaotic life, forcing me to endure her pain, her sorrow, and I couldn't escape. I woke up screaming only to find my phone ringing. It was Dave, complaining about work and wondering why I hadn't answered his earlier texts. Disoriented, I found myself slipping back into my old habits, feeling guilty for prioritizing my own needs. But the dreams persisted, now more graphic, engulfing me in an abyss of despair until I found myself standing at a crossroads. With the nights blurring into terrifying echoes of my psyche, I realized I could either allow these feelings to suffocate me or confront them. I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and dialed Jessica's number. "We need to talk," I said firmly. "I care about you, but I can't be available for you like I was before." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as her voice dripped with disbelief. "You're choosing your own needs over mine? How could you be this selfish?" Each word sent toxic daggers into my heart, but for the first time, I stood my ground. I repeated, "I care about you, but I need space." The call ended with her rage echoing in my ears, yet strangely enough, I felt an odd sense of freedom. I didn't recognize the person I was becoming, but she felt strong, determined. As the days passed, the nightmares faded, replaced with a confidence I had never known. I decided to invest in self-care, attending yoga classes, journaling my thoughts, and exploring what I truly wanted in life without feeling suffocated by others' expectations. The darkness within me started to lift, and, in one fateful night, I dreamt of an immense light breaking through the fog, illuminating a path of clarity and ease. I stood strong, free, and no longer enslaved by unrealistic demands. It was a new beginning, one that promised endless possibilities. I knew I was on the right path. And even though Jessica and others might not understand, I realized that setting boundaries didn't mean shame or guilt, it meant self-love and respect. Days turned into weeks, and my nightmares became distant memories. I had learned to embrace the uncertainty of life and accept that not everyone would like the new me. But I'd take this version over the past any day. And to that haunting voice, I now replied, "I made this mess, yes, but I'm cleaning it up on my terms." The darkness dissipated altogether, replaced by brightness, and it's all thanks to that journey and learning to set those boundaries. I still remember the day like it was yesterday, the shimmering chaos of sunlight pouring through the branches outside my window that early afternoon. It was a Saturday, a perfect day for relaxing, not one that I'd expect would lead to something so entwined with dread and despair. My phone rang, its shrill tone shattering the tranquil silence. It was Jenna, my best friend since childhood. Her voice trembled through the receiver, and though it was faint, I could hear the fear bubbling just below the surface. "I need you," she whispered, and my heart dropped. Jenna had always been the strong one, the rock in our friendship, the person I leaned on when life felt too heavy. But I could also hear something else, the panic that seeped into her words twisted in my gut. I asked her what was wrong, and she simply replied, "Come over." The silence that hung in the air afterward felt like a heavy blanket, one I couldn't shake. I didn't hesitate. My legs moved like they knew the way even before my mind caught up, and I jumped into my car, excitement mingling with dread. The drive felt unnaturally short. I parked in her driveway, my heart racing as I approached her front door. I knocked, and the sound echoed through the stillness of the neighborhood. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. Her eyes were puffy and red, like she'd been crying for days. I stepped past her into the dimly lit living room, the air heavy with something I couldn't quite place. It was thick with a sense of loss. She didn't say a word, just gestured toward the couch. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a seat. "Jenna, what's going on? You're scaring me." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she looked down, tracing patterns on the fabric of the cushions. "It's about my brother. He's gone." At that, my heart plummeted. I sat there, frozen in the weight of those words. Over the years, I had seen Jenna's brother during holidays and family gatherings. He always brought a smile to her face, always the supportive sibling. I could see the pain in her eyes. It was a reflection of the darkness that came when someone you love is ripped away from you. What happened? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Jenna swallowed hard, her breathing hitching. He died in a car accident last night. She looked at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't even get to say goodbye. It broke me to see her suffering. I struggled to find the right words, something to ease the ache in her heart, but nothing seemed sufficient. My heart ached for her as she recounted the details. This was no longer just a simple tragedy, it was a torment that seeped through every word, twisting her grief into a palpable entity in the room. I reached out, placing my hand over hers. I wanted to comfort her, to be the rock she had always been for me. The silence that followed was deafening, only punctuated by Jenna's quiet sobs. But I knew I had to do more, to be more. I remembered something her brother used to tell me whenever we talked about facing fears: you can't let life give you only darkness. You have to seek the light. I stood up, took a deep breath, and offered her a challenge. Let's go out. I know it feels impossible right now, but you've got to let the fresh air in. Let's go on a little adventure, one that he would have loved. She looked up at me, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. I kept my gaze steady, hoping to connect with that little spark of life I knew was still in her. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she nodded. I didn't know what to expect. We ended up driving to the lake, the sun still high in the sky, little ripples dancing across the surface of the water. But it wasn't just the beauty of the view that caught my attention. As we sat on the dock, the sun glistening off the water's surface, Jenna eventually started to open up. We shared stories, memories of happier times, even recounting stupid things we did as teenagers. Laughter broke through the darkness, like rays of sun penetrating a thick fog, and I could feel the weight on her shoulders lift just a little. And then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, she pulled out her phone. I want to look at his pictures, she whispered, hesitating between grief and longing. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat as we scrolled through the images. Each smile brought with it a mix of joy and sorrow. Jenna began to cry, but this time it felt different. Each tear seemed to carry with it a piece of the heartache that she could now put down, at least for a moment. We stayed there until night fell, sharing silence interjected with quiet laughter, moments of remembrance, and the occasional sigh of sorrow. That day, we basked in the beauty of the memories, even as the shadow of grief lingered nearby. I could see Jenna's pain turn into a bittersweet recognition of love, and I felt a strange comfort in knowing that I might not be able to erase her suffering, but I could be there to witness it. I drove her home that night, and as we parked, she turned to me, her eyes still shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you for being here," she said, a fragile smile breaking through the gloom. "I thought I would drown in my sorrow, but you helped me breathe." I realized then that it wasn't just about the adventure or the distraction. It was about connection, about being present for each other in our darkest moments. Sometimes, that's all it takes to light the way forward. I've never forgotten that day. Life has its share of darkness, but through it all, I learned the profound impact of being there for someone else. I helped Jenna that day, but in truth, she helped me too, reminding me of the delicate dance between light and shadow, and how, together, we can navigate the valleys of our grief and emerge stronger on the other side. I never thought a single night would change my life forever, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the universe has a way of throwing unexpected challenges at you when you least expect it. It was a dreary Wednesday evening in November, and I had just finished my shift at the diner. I always took the bus home, the last route running late enough that I could see the flickering streetlights morph into a strange glow amid the falling rain. The air was thick with dampness and the low hum of the bus engine droned on, lulling me into a state of comfort that almost made me forget the unsatisfying day I had. My mind was racing through thoughts of school, rent, and how I'd make it to the end of the month on my meager paycheck when I noticed her. She was sitting at the back of the bus, hunched over in the shadows, her trembling hands hidden in the folds of an oversized coat. The kind you'd wear on an even colder day, yet the chill of despair she radiated was palpable even from my seat. Her face was partially obscured by a curtain of matted hair. The atmosphere shifted around her. Despite my exhaustion, I felt an inexplicable need to approach her. It took every ounce of resolve to shake off my reservations and walk toward her. I just wanted to ask if she was okay, though something deep part of me knew that this was more than just the kindness of a stranger. As I reached her seat, I finally gathered the courage to speak, leaning slightly forward so my voice could slice through the clatter of the bus. "Hey! Are you all right?" The moment I said it, I thought she might leap from her seat or shriek at me to go away, but instead, she startled slightly, her head snapping up as if I were a ghost. Her eyes, wide and empty like hollowed sockets, met mine, and with a raspy breath, she whispered, "Help me. Please." I couldn't have been more taken aback if she had slapped me across the face. I wish I had listened to the warning bells in my head, but somehow those words sparked something fierce in my chest. I asked her how I could help, but the way her expression shifted, a mixture of relief and immense fear, shot an electric jolt through me. She hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty bus, and then leaned in close enough that I could smell the sourness of her dread mixed with rain-soaked cloth. "There's something chasing me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Instinct told me it was just the ramblings of a troubled mind, but her fear cut so deeply that I couldn't dismiss it. I found myself nodding, trying to maintain an air of calm despite the gnawing question spiraling in my gut. "What do you mean? Chasing you? Are you in danger?" I pressed, keeping my voice as steady as I could. At that moment, the bus jostled, and she flinched as though she'd just heard a gunshot. It's a shadow. It stalks me. It won't leave me alone." My skepticism battled against an odd sense of urgency. Whatever she was fighting against seemed so real to her, and it kind of became real to me in that moment too. "You're safe here," I said, not entirely convinced of my own words. "We'll be at the station soon, and then you can go home." She shook her head violently, her hair whipped around her face like a veil of despair. "No. I can't go home. It'll come for me. It's always watching." My heart raced at her frantic energy, the way she was trapped in her own terror. It made me think about how many people I'd passed by in my life who might have been grappling with similar fears in silence. I told her, "If I stay with you until you get home, will you be okay?" She paused and looked at me as if weighing my offer. Gradually, the frantic glimmer in her eyes began to settle, and I could see a sliver of hope creeping in. You would do that?" Her voice was fragile as glass. "Of course," I nodded honestly, feeling that flutter of determination rising inside of me. She blinked, and for a split second, the shadow of a smile cracked the mask of fear, but then her expression darkened again as if the very act of smiling would summon whatever loomed in the dark. The bus screeched to a halt at the station, a plume of steam tunneling through the interior as the doors clanked open. I gave her a reassuring nod, but as we stepped off the bus, I couldn't shake the suffocating sense that eyes were watching us. The rain had intensified, and the streetlights struggled to pierce the shroud of mist that settled over the pavement like a heavy blanket. She led the way, shuffling almost childlike down the sidewalk, and I fell into step beside her, casting furtive glances into the murky shadows lining the alleyways. I briefly wondered what kind of dark secrets lurked in these depths. "This way," she whispered, pulling me further away from the main road until the cacophony of the busy street faded into the background, a sense of trepidation coiling in my stomach. We walked for what felt like an eternity until we arrived at a small, dilapidated house crammed between two brick buildings. We climbed the rickety steps, and she fumbled with the key, her hands shaking as if the very act of unlocking the door felt monumental. It creaked open, revealing an interior drenched in darkness. I hesitated on the threshold, the air inside thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on, fear, suffocation, and desperation all wrapped into one. As she stepped inside, I followed, feeling the weight of an unspoken promise. She clicked on a single lamp that cast more shadows than light, and I could see both the chaos of her home and the struggle in her eyes. "You're safe now," I reassured her, glancing around at the peeling walls and the overrun piles of cardboard and debris. But even as I said it, my heart thudded with doubt. The air felt charged, and my instincts warned me that something wasn't right. Her gaze darted toward the window, her breath quickening as if she sensed something from the dark. "I can't stay here." "Not alone," she gasped, fingers digging into the wall as if it could somehow absorb her fear. "It'll come." The urgency surged in my chest again, and without thinking, I stepped closer, wrapping my arms around her to let her know I was there, that I wouldn't abandon her like everyone else had. "I won't let it get to you, you have my word," I said, almost unsure of what I was promising. But the moment hung heavy in the air, punctuated by the muffled sounds from the outside world. And then, a noise cut through, like a whisper. It was so faint, so soft that if I hadn't been on edge, I might have missed it. The girl stiffened, each muscle taut with terror, and her gaze flew to the door, as if she could sense its presence creeping in. I took a cautious step back, not entirely sure what I had plunged myself into. "What's happening?" I breathed, the fear creeping into my voice. "It's here," she whimpered as the shadows around us twisted and contorted, morphing into shapes I couldn't comprehend. There was an uncanny sense of suffocation, as if the very walls were closing in around us. "I can't see it, but I can feel it." I forced myself to stay calm, to remind her that she wasn't alone. "We need to get out of here," I said, but before I could take another breath, a jolt rippled through the air. The darkness felt alive, it drew closer, and I could practically sense the weight of its gaze pinning us down. Time seemed to stretch and coil as my heart thundered in my chest. "Hold on to me," I called out as I felt her grip tighten around my arm. With that, I yanked open the door and plunged into the rain-soaked evening, dragging her behind me. We stumbled into the night, and as we took off down the street, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to loosen its grip just slightly. It followed us, though, a suffocating presence clawing at my back, but I wouldn't dare look. Not now. Somehow, neither of us had stopped running. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I felt her presence beside me like a lifeline. The city blurred around us, turning into a distorted carousel of colors. I kept pushing forward, focused on the rhythm of our breaths, as if the pounding of our hearts could keep the darkness at bay even for a little longer. We finally turned a corner, and a small park appeared ahead, illuminated by the soft glow of a single, flickering streetlight. "And not here," she gasped, trembling at my side, her eyes darting around. It was then I understood. She thought the shadows would consume her anywhere that felt like stillness. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of help but found only the eerie quiet that fell like a blanket around us. She dug her fingers into my wrist, and I felt the desperation surging in her touch. "We have to keep moving," I shouted, forcing my feet to carry us past the light and deeper into the twisting paths of the park. I could hear her panting, the sheer panic radiating from her. Her fear was infectious, wrapping around us tighter than the very shadows we fled. We dashed past trees bent inwards as though they had gazes of their own, the wind howling vigorously around us. It felt like we were trapped in a nightmare, a relentless race against an unspeakable force. "Please." "I can't," she began, before suddenly freezing mid-sentence. I yanked her along the path just in time as something dark and looming shot past us, nearly brushing the collar of my coat. We stumbled forward, pushing ever deeper into an unforgiving weave of branches and shadows. "What is it?" I yelled, my heart pounding in a chaotic rhythm. "What is pursuing you?" But she could only recoil, a mixture of horror and disbelief twisting her face as she failed to articulate her fear. Just as we rounded another corner, I caught sight of something flitting through the trees, an indistinct form, cruel and sharpened at the edges, flickering in and out of the shadows it inhabited. I felt bile rise in my throat. I had never believed in ghosts or ghouls, but at that moment, the urge to dismiss reality became a desperate fight for survival. "I won't leave you," I shouted into the silence, propelling us forward into the dark. Whatever was chasing her felt all-consuming, like a part of her life she couldn't outrun, and yet here I was, lost alongside her. We raced toward the park exit, my lungs burning, desperate to escape the murky illusion of impending doom creeping closer with every heartbeat. Just a few more feet, I thought, we need to reach the street. Suddenly, as if the shadows themselves were closing in, she stumbled, and I had to jerk her up. "Keep going," I pleaded, the panic bleeding into my voice as I dragged her along. Then, out of nowhere, we burst into the street, a cacophony of lights exploding around us, and I felt the darkness recede just slightly, as if we'd stepped out from under a dark cloud. We halted, gasping for breath. The rush of adrenaline began to fade as the chaos transformed into something familiar, the sounds of the city, busy and alive again. She swayed beside me, gripping my wrist as if it were her last tether to sanity. And then I heard it, the whisper from before, almost smiling with a sinister reassurance. I wanted to turn around, confront the source of our fear, but I saw it, a shape barely perceptible in the shadows, but it didn't follow. No, it merely loomed, as if waiting for the moment we would falter again. "What was that?" I managed, and she bit her lip, tears pooling in her wide eyes. "It's a part of me," she stammered, quaking as realization swept across her face. "I'm sorry. I thought I could outrun it." I held her tighter, confusion bubbling inside my chest. You don't have to run anymore, I said gently, even though my heart thundered as I glanced toward the shrouded figure. You fought it, you're still here. The words felt like a flimsy bandage over a gaping wound. But as we stood there, staring back at whatever darkness she had once called her own, something in her shifted. I can't escape it, she whispered, her voice steadying. But I can embrace it. I need to face it, and I need to stop running. I felt a wave of sympathy ripple through me, grief for whatever had haunted her all this time. In that moment, I understood, her journey was just beginning, one that I could no longer be a part of. No one can do this for you, you have to do it yourself, I said gently. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, and I knew whatever darkness she had faced couldn't take her again. As I watched her resolve take shape, I felt a flicker of hope igniting within me too, a moment of clarity that seemed to pierce the fog of running shadows around us. With that, I backed away, finally accepting that it was time to let go, to relinquish the grip I had on her memories and fears. She stood there, absorbing the moment as she felt the shadows sway around them, no longer a chaser but a part of her past she would confront. And without a backward glance, I turned away, those dark silhouettes echoing behind me as they receded into the mist. I'd done what I could, and somehow I knew that she would be okay. I had always been afraid that I couldn't make a difference, not in the grand scheme of life. But that night, at the edge of darkness and light, I found out that sometimes, helping someone meant standing beside them until they found the strength to face their shadows alone, and perhaps, in doing so, I had made a difference. When I helped my friend through their grief, I never expected it to unravel the very fabric of our reality. I want to share what happened because it isn't just a story of loss but of something much darker that came to visit in the shadows of our sorrow. 2 months ago, my best friend Mia lost her younger brother, Ethan, in a freak accident. He was only 16, full of energy and dreams. It rocked our small town, a tragedy that gripped all of us. Students wore black ribbons and the school held a memorial that felt more like a funeral than a goodbye. Mia was devastated, as anyone could imagine. She often talked about how they used to chase fireflies in late summer, laughter echoing in the dark, and now all she felt was a deafening silence. Out of love for her, I pushed aside my own discomfort with grief. I couldn't stand to see her like this. So I started showing up at her house, ready to listen, ready to help. Initially, it was comforting for both of us. We reminisced about Ethan, bringing back happy memories to cut through the shadow that lingers when someone we love is gone. Mia would wipe her tears, chuckle at the goofy things Ethan did, and for a moment, it felt like he was still with us. But as the weeks passed, the laughter faded, and the deep sadness morphed into something else, something heavier. Mia began to have these episodes where she would sit in silence, staring into space, her eyes losing their light. One night, as we sat on her bedroom floor surrounded by candles and photographs, I noticed a strange glimmer in her eyes, a mixture of grief and something else, something darker. That's when she mentioned finding Ethan's old journal hidden in the back of his closet. She said it was filled with doodles and stories he never shared, but near the end, there were unnerving, scribbled lines that read, "I wish I could bring back what's lost." Created from the innocent words of a boy who was imagining fantastical things, it carried an unusual weight. Over the next few days, Mia started acting strangely. She would stop in mid-sentence, as if she were listening to something behind me. I brushed it off as a side effect of her grief, a mind trying to connect with its loss. But then I noticed she had begun to sleep less. One night, I stayed over, worried about her deteriorating state. I awoke to the sound of soft murmuring. My heart raced as I turned to look, finding Mia sitting up, clutching Ethan's journal close to her chest, her eyes glazed over. "He's here," she whispered in a voice that barely resembled her own. "He's talking to me." It sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know how to comfort her. Instead, I lay still, pretending to sleep, fearful that any movement might break whatever moment she was experiencing. The next day, she seemed different, more energetic yet increasingly erratic, as if she was being pulled into another reality just out of reach. She insisted that Ethan wanted us to do something for him, something that could bring him back. I tried to talk her out of it, but the deeper she'd slip into her grief-fueled obsession, the harder it became for me to reach her. Then, one evening, she proposed a plan. "We need to do a séance," she said fervently, clutching the journal. "I can feel him. We can bring him back." Desperation lined her voice, a plea that gripped my heart, twisting it painfully. Against my better judgment, I agreed, thinking it might offer her some closure. We set it up in her backyard on a night when the moon hung low, cloaked in clouds. The air felt electric as we lit the candles around a makeshift table with a few friends who reluctantly joined, humor tinged with unease. We joined hands, the flickering flames casting ominous shadows. Mia spoke Ethan's name repeatedly, her voice rising and falling as she recited passages from his journal. It was intoxicating yet terrifying, a pull I could feel with every beat of my heart. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and shadows stretched, swirling in ways I couldn't comprehend. A feeling swept over me, a pressure that pinned me in place, as if something was drawing closer. I glanced at Mia, she was entranced, eyes glazed. Then, something happened. A whisper danced across the air, barely perceptible but undeniable, "Help me." My blood ran cold. It wasn't Ethan's voice but something heavy, dark, and threatening. Panic surged in my chest, and instinct kicked in. I shouted, breaking the circle, desperate to disengage from whatever presence we had pulled forth. Mia's eyes snapped to mine, pure terror reflected there. "Stop!" she screamed, but the darkness had already settled in deeply. The candles flickered violently, and a wind whipped through, extinguishing them one by one until we were enveloped in shadow. Everything spiraled as we desperately tried to reclaim our connection to reality. The candles extinguished louder than I'd thought, lots of yelps echoed, and something cold wrapped around my ankles, pulling at me as if the earth itself had turned against us. Ghostly laughter, chilling and distant, filled the air. We stumbled back, our hearts racing. With a final snap of the dark, we fled toward her house, shoving past everything that felt wrong, the energy still hanging over us like static. In the days that followed, Mia retreated further into madness. She would sit in her room, whispering into the journal as if conversing with someone invisible. The moments we'd shared had transformed into something grotesque, and I felt helpless, watching her unravel. One night, I received a frantic call from Mia. When I rushed over, I found her sitting on the floor, Ethan's journal open beside her. "You have to help me. He's angry," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "He wants to come back. He needs to come back." If I could turn back time, I would have never opened that journal or agreed to that séance. The air was thick with regret, loss gripped me tighter, but what was more terrifying was the realization that she might not be talking about Ethan anymore. That night, when I laid in bed, I could hear whispers, soft, coaxing voices just on the verge of comprehension. They filled my room, growing louder until their sinister melody became so intrusive that sleep was impossible. It's been weeks now since that night, and I am sitting here at my desk, Mia's journal clutched tightly in my hands. She disappeared 2 days ago. Just vanished from her home, leaving only the journal and a note that read, "Don't bring him back." But I can't stop hearing those voices, and every night they grow louder, begging me to listen. I don't know what I'll do next. I'm terrified at the thought of opening the journal again, but I miss Mia, and maybe I can find her, maybe I can help her, even if it means plunging deeper into the darkness we awakened. So this is where I'm stuck, teetering on the edge, knowing each night that I might just lose myself to whatever we summoned. Something in there was never meant to come back, and now it clings to my soul like a thick fog, feeding on my hope. If you're reading this, I need you to understand, grief can open the doors we never wanted to see. Please learn from me, don't cross the threshold, because once you do, there's no guarantee you can ever come back. Now I hear the whispers again, closer than ever, and tonight I plan to listen. I never thought I'd find my way back to writing. It had always been my escape, my sanctuary, until life dug its claws in, and I let it slip away. A dull ache settled in my chest, a feeling of irrelevance that gnawed at my mind like a ravenous creature. I spent years buried in the monotonous grind of a 9-to-5 job, swallowing my dreams as I packed away the remnants of my creativity into an old cardboard box labeled past. Until one evening last fall, the world around me turned dark and overcast, heavy with the threat of an impending storm. I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone, and then, in the depths of a rabbit hole filled with nostalgia, I stumbled upon an old blog I had created back in college, a place where I once poured my heart into stories that felt so alive. With shaky fingers, I tapped the screen, and the words came rushing back. I read through my posts, laughing at the innocence of my youthful ambition, but at the same time, I felt this pulse of yearning, this whisper that grew louder with each word. That night I decided to dig deeper, to open the box, searching for the faded notebook where I once scribbled ideas and dreams. As I unfolded the tattered pages, an unfamiliar scent floated in the air, like old parchment and nostalgia, and I was transported back to those late-night writing sessions fueled by coffee and unfiltered creativity. But something was different this time. An unsettling energy crackled just beneath the surface, as if my old muses were waking from slumber and stretching their limbs. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching me, lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. Dismissing it as a figment of my imagination, I pored over my words once again, each story pulling me deeper into an abyss I hadn't realized was hiding within me. 2 nights later, inspired by that spark, I sat down at my dusty desk, jotting down a story I had always wanted to tell. Words poured out with a fervor, a manic drive I hadn't experienced in years. Yet, as I typed, the air in the room thickened, and shadows danced at the corners of my vision, playing tricks on my mind. At first, I brushed it off as fatigue, but then I noticed the whispers. A soft, almost imperceptible murmur, echoing my thoughts, guiding my fingers across the keyboard to places I hadn't intended to go. It was exhilarating and terrifying. As each night passed, I felt compelled to write more, the words flowing like an unending river, but with every tale I created, the whispers grew bolder, more insistent. They began suggesting plot twists, characters whose endings were not theirs to choose, twisting my stories into something darker. I pushed back, thinking perhaps that was the true culmination of my creativity, having my plots veer into the surreal. Yet nothing could prepare me for the night I realized this wasn't just a benign inspiration, my stories were alive. One evening, I had just finished a particularly twisted tale about a writer who uncovers a sinister secret in the very pages of his manuscript. With a satisfied sigh, I leaned back, only for my heart to plummet as I heard my own story come to life around me. The room dimmed, the shadows deepened, and an icy chill swept through the air. Before I could register the change, my laptop's screen flickered, displaying words that were not my own, a story unfolding in real time that felt so painfully familiar. It was as though the very fabric of reality was being warped by my own desires and fears, morphed into a narrative I didn't control. Trying to remain rational, I convinced myself it was my imagination running wild, but when the whispers turned to voices, clear and malicious in their glee, the illusion shattered. Panic surged through me. I pushed the laptop away, heart racing, but the voices followed, pasting themselves against my thoughts, forcing images of my fears, my insecurities, promising that I'd never escape the stories I had dared to tell. That night, sleep eluded me, and the shadows grew. I became obsessed, drawn deeper into the labyrinth of my own mind, fighting the voices that seemed to intertwine with the very essence of my being. I reached a breaking point, desperate to silence the chaos swirling around me, so I decided to confront it. I locked myself indoors, refusing to leave until I sought the truth. As I clenched my pen, my heart pounded louder in my chest, a steady rhythm matching the furious scratching of ink against paper. I wrote, weaving together every terrifying experience, every nightmare into one final story, hoping it would exorcise the demons haunting me. I saw shadows growing tall and dark, whispering lines that echoed back through the pages unopened and unseen, my story revealing its twisted love for chaos. And just as I penned the last line, the room dropped into silence, that suffocating, terrifying silence that allowed room for dread to creep back in. My heart pounded as I looked around, hoping to feel the release I sought, but instead, I felt the walls tighten around me. Words scrawled across my unfinished manuscript, racing faster than I could comprehend, forcing me to relive my own creations as they blossomed into terrifying beasts. I remember thinking, I have to stop. But I couldn't. My pen moved faster, the stories consuming me, each character I created was birthed from the darkest corners of my mind only to turn against me. I realized then, with a sickening jolt of understanding, that I was no longer the author. I had become a mere vessel in this narrative woven from my own despair. They were coming for me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the laughter, horrifying, echoing laughter that bounced off the walls, cold and taunting, as I succumbed to the very stories I dared to tell. I don't know how long I've been trapped in this nightmare, the line between reality and fiction blurring until all that remained were the voices of my characters, all too alive, feasting on my words, and all the while illuminating the path for a writer yet to discover their own tale. So, here I am, sharing the echoes of my story, hoping someone out there will hear my warning. Rediscovering your passion can lead you to places you never wished to visit. When you let the words take control, they might just remind you how to write your own end. It was a chilly autumn evening when I first stumbled upon the forum, an anonymous space where people poured out their darkest thoughts and harrowing experiences. I had been feeling particularly low that day, the weight of my depression heavier than usual, and as I sat in the dim glow of my computer screen, I searched for something, anything, that could help me feel less solitary in my pain. That's when I found a thread titled "The Moment I Realized I Wasn't Alone in My Struggles." The stories shared within were raw, visceral, and intoxicatingly haunting, like a siren's call pulling me deeper into the abyss. I scroll through tales of loss, despair, and recovery, each heartfelt post striking a familiar chord within me. As I read, I felt the tightening grip of tears in my throat, but there was a strange comfort in knowing that I wasn't the only one wrestling with my demons. Encouraged by their bravery, I mustered the courage to share my own experience, detailing a particularly dark period of my life, the lies I'd told myself, and the hollow echo of desperation that filled my nights. I pressed submit and sat back, anxiety and hope competing in my chest. Little did I know that submitting my story would unleash something far darker than my anguish. The next morning, I woke to a notification that someone had replied to my post. It was a well-written comment, empathizing with my struggles, but the username sent a chill down my spine. Not so alone. This individual told me that they, too, felt isolated and burdened by their issues, but what struck me was their suggestion to meet in person, not in a way that was threatening, rather, it felt almost like a lifeline thrown amid my stormy sea. Curiosity piqued, I found myself agreeing to meet them at a nearby cafe later that week, under the guise of anonymity, both of us going under pseudonyms. The day arrived, and my heart raced with both excitement and dread as I sat at a corner table, nervously fidgeting with my phone. After what felt like an eternity, a figure approached, pulling their hoodie slightly lower over their face. They looked around, seeking someone, then their gaze landed on me. "You must be Silent Echo," they said, a soft smile breaking through their nervousness. I nodded, still skeptical but intrigued. Our conversation flowed easily, our shared experiences creating a bond that felt surreal. They mirrored my truths, recounted their struggles with isolation, and tasted despair like it was a bitter wine we had both drunk from. We were two souls adrift on the same current, but then, as dusk crept in, the topic took a sharper turn. "Have you ever felt like you were being watched?" Not So Alone asked, glancing over their shoulder. An uneasy chill crawled along my spine, and I forced a laugh, dismissing it as paranoia. But they persisted, sharing strange coincidences and eerie sensations that had plagued them since childhood. As I listened, the growing unease shifted through the cafe, and suddenly, the world outside felt distant, eerie, like a fog enveloping reality. Just as I was about to suggest we change the subject, a figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the early evening glow. It was a man, disheveled and weathered, and for a heartbeat, our gazes locked. I felt my heart race, as if he saw straight through me, a pitiless gaze weighing my secrets. Then, just as quickly, he turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the street. Not So Alone seemed to distract themselves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. We finished our drinks, and as we stood to leave, they looked at me, a mix of seriousness and fear in their eyes. "Can I walk you to your car?" I barely hesitated before accepting, the storm inside me now roaring louder than ever. We exited the cafe, and the chill of the night tightened like a vice. As we reached the parking lot, I spotted my car and felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But just as I was about to thank them and say goodbye, a terrible scream shattered the silence, a sound that was human yet primal, cutting through the nighttime haze. We turned in unison, our hearts pounding like war drums, to find that same man from earlier, now writhing on the ground, clutching his face. My breath hitched as I took a hesitant step forward. Not So Alone grabbed my arm, holding me back. "Don't," they whispered, their voice trembling. "We need to go." Confusion clouded my mind as I searched their eyes for answers. But the man's cries echoed, a desperate plea that sent ice through my veins, and I found myself frozen as he twisted, eyes wide with terror, whispering something incomprehensible. I felt an instinctual pull to help, but Not So Alone's grip tightened, and I realized their face was pale, lips trembling. "You don't understand," they blurted. "He can see us. He knows we're connected." My stomach churned, and a deep-seated fear unfurled within me. The man suddenly grew still, staring directly at us, and it was as if a fog lifted from his mind. "Help me," he cried unexpectedly, the initial pain in his voice replaced by clarity. "It's coming for you both. You have to run." Without thinking, we turned and bolted toward my car. The fear of the unknown propelled us, instinct screaming at me that something dark was rising from the shadows to claim us. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and as I finally unlocked the doors, I felt Not So Alone push me inside, following suit and slamming the door shut just as I turned the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man staring at us, now completely still, with a knowing dread hanging in the air around him. The last thing I saw before we sped away was his quiet lip movement, whispering something I couldn't make out. I drove in a daze, the streets transformed into a blurred smear of lights as dread pulsed in time with my heartbeat. "What in the hell was that?" I asked, feeling adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We can't talk about this here," they replied, eyes wide. "I'll explain everything, but first, we need to reach safety." We drove in silence, the dark irony of it all gnawing at my consciousness. Just when I thought I had found a shared connection in my struggles, I inadvertently plunged myself into a nightmare. Finally, we pulled up to a large, old house not far from the city, a place seemingly trapped in forgotten time. "What is this place?" I questioned, my fingers still trembling. "This is where I've been hiding," Not So Alone answered, a shadow falling over their expression. "We can talk inside." Hesitant but too exhausted to argue, I followed them into the house. The air felt thick and stale, almost suffocating. Dust clung to the corners, and the silence enveloped us like a heavy shroud. Not So Alone led me to a dimly lit living room, where I finally sat, my heart still racing. "What happened out there?" I demanded, needing clarity amidst the chaos. Taking a deep breath, they began to share their story, how they had been part of a group, people caught in a web of shared misery, their collective pain manifesting something sinister. "The moment we started connecting, something started to watch us," they explained. "Something that feeds off our struggles. It sees our despair, and it grows stronger." I could hardly believe what I was hearing, but the terror etched in their face made it impossible to dismiss. The pieces began to fall into place in a horrifying mosaic of realization. We weren't just sharing our pain, we were drawing attention from something dark that thrived on our battles. I had thought finding connection would bring solace, yet instead, it had unearthed something ancient and stalking. "What do we do?" I whispered, fear prickling at every nerve ending. "We can't go back," they said, eyes glistening with tears. "But we have to warn the others, the ones still online." A wave of determination surged through me at the thought of saving those who remained oblivious. We quickly crafted a plan to return to the forum, to share our encounter, and ensure others would know not to fall into the same trap. Yet, as we prepared to leave, I noticed something shift outside, a shadow sweeping across the window, far darker than night should allow. Fear gripped me once again like a vice. Whatever stopped us was closing in. "We can't leave now," I urged. "It's here." Not So Alone's face paled, and just as they turned toward the door, the air grew cold, and a whisper filled the room, a chilling voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You're not alone anymore." In that moment, I understood I wasn't just battling my personal despair but something far greater, something intangible that reveled in our pain. The room darkened, shadows twisting and undulating as fear clawed at my throat. "We need to stick together," I cried. "We can't let it take us." But the shadows lunged, and their twisted forms took shape, weaving themselves through our emotions, my struggles, their own. It siphoned our despair and laughter, feeding on the bond we had forged. And then, I heard the man's voice again, echoing through the depths of my mind. "Help me." He was no longer outside but within, his anguish merging with ours, and something shifted in the air, a tether forged through pain, binding us to one another as the room erupted in chaos, pulling us away from our reality, and all I could think was that perhaps, in the end, we were never truly alone in our struggles. I want to share something with you that happened to me a while back. I promise it's not just another tired rehash of my high school public speaking class. This is about something far stranger, something that turned my life upside down. It started innocuously enough, a flyer at a coffee shop advertising an open mic night at a local community center. The topic? Anything you wanted. The moment I saw it, a rush of anxiety shot through me. I could barely muster the courage to speak in front of my friends, let alone a room full of strangers. But something compelled me to tear that flyer down, to scribble my name down, and hand it over to the woman at the counter. Maybe it was the coffee kicking in or a fleeting moment of bravery. I didn't have something prepared, of course. I had no idea what I'd even talk about. I spent the rest of the day pacing my apartment, my stomach churning, thoughts racing through my mind like a tornado. I thought about backing out, but then again, the idea of standing before people, bare and vulnerable, had somehow sparked a small flicker of excitement deep within me. The day arrived, and I could think of nothing else. I arrived at the community center just as the sun began to set, casting eerie shadows across the room. The atmosphere was thick with nervous energy, you could practically taste it in the air. I sat down at a table with a couple of other anxious souls, each of us stealing glances at one another, silently evaluating our competition. The first few acts were pretty standard: a hesitant singer, a humorous storyteller, an enthusiastic poet. I found myself marveling at their bravery, their ability to hold the audience in the palm of their hands, while I scribbled in my notebook, trying to draft an outline of what I might say. Finally, it was my turn. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the stage. I could feel my palms getting sweaty and my throat drying up. As I gripped the microphone, the audience quieted down. I could feel the weight of their gazes on me, judging, waiting. My mind went blank. The moments stretched out infinitely, and for a second, I thought about darting off stage like my instincts told me to. But I was there, and I knew it was now or never. "Hi," I managed to croak out, I'm here to share a story." A murmur ran through the crowd, intrigued or bored, I couldn't tell. But something had shifted inside me. I didn't plan to do this, but something about standing there made me feel alive. I began talking, first about my love for horror stories, my lifelong obsession with dark elements and urban legends. The audience leaned in, and what started as a shaky retelling exploded into vivid details. I spoke about a haunting I had experienced in my childhood home, how the shadows in my room would stretch and twist at night when the moonlight came through. As I wove the tale, I began to embody the fear I had felt back then. The audience was mesmerized, hanging on every word. The more passionately I spoke, the bolder I became. I could feel the energy of the crowd, it fueled me like a drug. I introduced a character from my story, an ethereal figure that seemed to appear and vanish like smoke. They were so captivated that I barely noticed the little things, my palms dripping with sweat, my racing heart, or the growing temperature in the room. I turned up the intensity. I described scenes in vivid detail, conjuring images of flickering lights and whispers echoing down dark hallways. I spoke of nights when I would wake to find my bedroom door ajar, an unseen presence lingering just behind it. The tension was palpable, people shifted in their seats, some gasped as I reached the climax of my story. I could see their expressions morph from curiosity to genuine fear, and it excited me. When I finished, there was an eerie silence that enveloped the room for a few heartbeats. Then, a thunderous applause erupted, shaking me to my very core. For the first time in my life, I felt validated not just as a person, but as a storyteller. I had never felt like this before, it was intoxicating. I stepped off the stage, my heart still racing, and for the next few days, I was floating. I couldn't get enough. I began writing feverishly, sharing my stories online, stalking the r/no-sleep subreddit like a devoted fan, soaking in the horror and intrigue. I had found not just a new hobby, but an obsession. But then something happened, things began to shift. I noticed strange glitches on my laptop while writing late at night, my words would rearrange themselves, sentences would change, horror whispers scuttling across my screen like spiders. At first, I shrugged it off as a software issue, but then those whispers became clearer, almost as if they had a voice of their own. I brushed it aside until one night, exhausted and drained, I typed out one of my darker tales. The moment I finished and hit submit, I heard it, a sinister laugh echoing in the stillness of my apartment. The kind of laughter that chilled your bones. I looked around, heart thumping. Nothing. Just my empty apartment and the dim glow of my laptop. I convinced myself I was simply overtired. A week passed, my obsession deepened, but so did the odd occurrences. I'd wake up to find my curtains drawn tight despite having left them wide open the night prior. Shadows danced along the walls even when I knew no one was there. I convinced myself it was writer's exhaustion, my imagination running wild, but deep down, I felt the grip of something far more significant. One evening after another unsettling night, I received a message from an anonymous user on the forum. Your words breathe life into the dead. The screen felt like it was glaring at me, demanding a response, but how could I? What could I say? Weeks passed, and I continued to write, but the whispers grew louder, the shadows more pronounced. The figure I had conjured on stage that night seemed to loom over my life now, unraveling realities I dared not imagine. I tried to reach out to others in the community, but my posts garnered little understanding. It was only when I stumbled upon an old forum thread dedicated to urban legends that I truly understood. A tale of a writer who had become too absorbed in their craft, one who had summoned something far beyond their control, losing their mind to the very stories they created. I read about a figure that could be summoned by speaking its name, a being that thrived on fear and attention, amplified by stories told in the dark. My blood ran cold. It was my own malefic creation, born of my darkest thoughts. I had unwittingly brought it forth, and now it clung to every word I typed. With desperate determination, I sought to break this connection, but the whispers only became more insistent, pleading for recognition. They demanded I share one last tale, promising if I did, they would let me go. I knew I had to confront it head-on, so I gathered all the courage I had left and scheduled my return to the community center for another open mic night. The audience was packed. As I stood there once more, gripping the microphone, the whispers crescendoed into frenetic chaos. I wove my tale, not just of horror, but of fear born from creation itself, igniting the very room. The entity listened, lurking in the shadows, waiting for my conclusion, my euphoric last moment. As I finished the haunting finale, the audience erupted into applause once again, but the laughter reemerged, a cacophony of delight, resonating in the depths of my fear. Yet, something shifted. With every clap, I felt a layer peel away, a binding shift that drew me from shackles that had tightened so fiercely over the weeks. In that single moment of collective fear and applause, life filled the void, and I knew I had claimed my power. I stepped down from that stage, leaving behind the horrid whispers and that dark presence behind. It took months to shake off the unease, the lingering sensations of something shadowy lurking just beyond my door. I still write today, but now I channel that passion into light, weaving fantastical tales, free from fear, aware of the potency of the words I use. So remember, if you find a passion that sends shivers down your spine, be wary. Because when you try public speaking, you might just summon something beyond the shadows, something that hangs on every word, waiting for your command, or your destruction. I stumbled upon an old journal yesterday that belonged to my childhood best friend, Sarah. It's been over a decade since I last saw her, and flipping through those yellowed pages unlocked something I thought I had buried deep, a mix of nostalgia and sorrow that overwhelmed me. Sarah and I had been inseparable ever since kindergarten, sharing secrets like they were candy, whispering dreams of the future under the starlit sky, and getting into all sorts of innocent mischief. Our bond was a tapestry woven with laughter and late-night adventures until one fateful day when she just vanished. No warning, no goodbye. One day, she was there, and the next, it was like she had evaporated. Her family had moved away overnight, and it was years before I finally learned they had left town in a hurry. I remember the endless summer of searching, the vacant spaces in my heart as I held onto her fading memory. Thankfully, we had our journal, our shared chronicle of friendship. As a kid, Sarah and I would fill its pages with drawings, doodled notes, funny stories, and even the occasional big secret we swore to keep forever. Flipping through it yesterday was like being open to a time capsule, each entry flung me back into our innocent past. There was a note where she wrote about a tree in her backyard, our secret meeting spot where we would retreat from the world. A line in her shaky handwriting caught my eye, "If we ever get lost, let's meet here. I can hear our laughter from far away." It hit me like a stone to the chest, her laughter echoing in memories long silenced. I held onto the journal tightly as if it were my last link to her, a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. I could feel a yearning in my chest, an overwhelming need to track her down, to find her again. But where do you search for someone who seemingly disappeared? After hours of research, a flicker, a single thread of hope. I discovered an online presence. She had left footprints in the digital world. Sarah had a social media account, and there was even a recent post featuring her smiling, standing beneath a familiar tree. It was the exact tree from our journal. The post looked recent. It was a picture of her beaming in the sunlight, a band of vibrant flowers across her hair. My heart raced. She was alive and well. I couldn't believe it. I sent her a message, pouring out my heart about all the memories we shared, the friendship that was abandoned but never forgotten, my hope for a reunion. Hours passed, and just as I was about to lose hope, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was her. "I've missed you," it read, along with an invitation to meet at the old tree. My heart pounded fiercely. It felt surreal, like phantoms of the past had materialized. I drove to that neighborhood, arriving back at the place that held so many threads of our childhood tapestry. The sun was beginning to set, draping everything in a warm, golden hue. I walked toward the tree, a giant oak that stood like a sentinel amidst the encroaching darkness. I stood there, my heart racing, filled with anticipation and anxiety. Would she recognize me? What if she has changed too much? My thoughts were interrupted by laughter, her laughter. It flowed through the air, lifting my spirits instantly. It was unmistakably Sarah. I turned and saw her, older but vividly the same, a piece of my past come to life. The moment our eyes locked, everything else faded. It felt like a time warp, as if the years disappeared. All that was left was the joy and love that bound us. She rushed towards me, and we embraced so tightly that it was like we were trying to fuse our two souls back into one. She was real, tangible, and more beautiful than my memories ever dared to suggest. We spent hours recounting stories and filling each other in on the lost years, the highs, and the lows. She explained why her family had left so abruptly, a sudden job transfer, a domestic upheaval, things she kept secret, trying to shield me from the pain. Time flowed like a river, sometimes gentle, sometimes roaring. And just as happiness enveloped us like a warm blanket, she shared something that shattered that momentary bliss. She had been living with a terminal illness for the past few years. It was devastating. After hearing her story, I felt torn, helpless. I had spent so much time searching for her only to discover shadowy clouds hanging over her life. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she shouldn't have to endure this. But we couldn't dwell on the darkness for long. Instead, we embraced every moment, every laugh, every nostalgic secret. As daylight signaled it was time to part ways, we promised to keep in touch, to be present in each other's lives once more, no matter the circumstances. Walking away from that tree, I felt an odd mixture of hope and heartache blooming within me. We had reconnected in a way that felt almost divine, but I also felt the clock ticking down, an ominous reminder of her fragile condition. That night, I lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling of how lucky I was, and so scared. I didn't sleep much, consumed by thoughts of my friend who so bravely faced her mortality. Over the next few weeks, we met frequently, sharing moments that felt transcendent against the weight of reality. Each time we parted, my heart sank knowing she was fighting a battle so fierce. But then one evening, something unbelievable happened. I received a call from her mother. A panic gripped me as I answered. "She wants to see you," were the first words that nearly knocked the breath out of me. I rushed to her house, nearly shaking with anxiety as I knocked on the door. Her mother led me to the living room, a somber expression on her face. Sarah was there, propped up in bed, a fragile shadow of the vibrant friend I once knew. I held her hand, and we spent what felt like mere moments talking. "There's something I want to share with you," she said, her voice barely a whisper but filled with conviction. Before we lost touch, I wrote something I never got to say. It was then she revealed the journal I had found, a testament to years of friendship and dreams. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I listened to her words, long unspoken feelings that were raw and real. It struck me, this powerful bond we shared knew no boundaries, not even time or sickness. And so we vowed, as the days grew shorter and the nights emerged with uncertainty, to cherish each moment left, to be a source of comfort and strength for one another. The last page of her journal remained blank for a reason, and when the time came for her final rest, I took it upon myself to fill it with everything she had meant to me, every cherished memory and every love-filled line, ensuring she would carry with her the warmth of our friendship always. I felt as if we had traveled through time, binding the threads of our lives with every shared smile and tear. It was a heartwarming reunion that transcended mere chance. It was the universe reminding me that some souls never truly part ways. Even in the face of adversity, our friendship endured like the roots of that ancient oak, deep and unwavering, a testament that love could both heal and endure all. As I sat there beside her, I realized that some friendships, like the tree in the backyard, stay anchored in time, forever part of who we are, intertwined with the narratives of our lives. And even if that thread seemed fine, frail under the weight of reality, it would remain, like fireflies lighting the darkness of the night, illuminating, guiding, and reminding us of what truly matters in life. The moment I knew I had to change my life, my awakening. The moment I knew I had to change my life wasn't one of those gradual realizations that build over time. It was like getting hit by a freight train of clarity, a single instant that shattered the glass of denial I'd been hiding behind. It was late one evening, and I was sitting in my cluttered apartment, the kind of mess that had become so familiar I stopped noticing it. Pizza boxes stacked in the corner, unwashed dishes filling the sink, a faint smell of something I couldn't quite place but knew wasn't pleasant. My laptop was balanced precariously on my knees, glowing with the pale blue light of yet another mindless binge-watching session. I wasn't even paying attention to the show. My phone buzzed beside me, and for a moment, I ignored it. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone. But then it buzzed again, and something in me compelled me to glance at the screen. It was a notification for an event I'd completely forgotten about, a reunion for my college friends, a group I hadn't seen in years. The picture attached to the invite was a candid shot of us from our senior year. We looked so young, so full of life, laughing together on the quad with the sun setting behind us. I stared at the photo, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The person in the picture had bright eyes, a genuine smile, a spark of something I couldn't even name. The person sitting on that couch, staring at the screen, was a shadow of that. I hadn't just let myself go physically, I'd let everything go. My dreams, my ambitions, even my connections to the people who once mattered most. It was like waking up from a deep sleep and realizing you'd been sleepwalking through your life for years. I started scrolling through old photos, unable to stop myself, and with every picture, the weight in my chest grew heavier. There I was, climbing a mountain during a spring break trip, arms outstretched as if I could touch the sky. There I was, at a karaoke bar, belting out a song terribly but confidently, with my friends cheering me on. There I was, at graduation, clutching my diploma with tears in my eyes, ready to take on the world. What had happened to that person? The answer wasn't hard to find. Somewhere along the way, I'd started choosing the easy path, the path of least resistance. I'd taken a job I didn't love because it paid the bills. I'd stopped reaching out to friends because it was easier to stay in and avoid the effort. I'd let my hobbies and passions collect dust because there was always tomorrow to pick them back up, except tomorrow never came. The realization was suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in the life I'd created, a life that wasn't really living. The worst part was knowing that no one had done this to me. I couldn't blame anyone else. I had chosen this, step by step, day by day, until I'd ended up in a place I hated. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed a notebook from the pile of clutter on my coffee table and started writing. At first, it was just a stream of consciousness, messy and chaotic, but then it started to take shape. I wrote down everything I hated about my current life, the job that drained me, the loneliness that clung to me like a second skin, the sense of purposelessness that had taken root in my soul. But then I flipped to a new page and started writing down what I wanted. Not the vague, abstract dreams of happiness or success, but concrete, tangible things. I wanted to reconnect with my friends. I wanted to feel healthy and strong again. I wanted to wake up in the morning excited about something, anything. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. The next day, I called out of work. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew I couldn't keep going through the motions. I spent the day cleaning my apartment, scrubbing away not just the physical mess but the emotional weight it represented. I deleted the fast food apps on my phone and made a grocery list of real, nourishing food. I texted the friend who had sent the reunion invite, apologizing for being out of touch and asking if they wanted to grab coffee before the event. It was terrifying, reaching out after so much time, but their enthusiastic response melted some of the fear away. Over the next few weeks, I kept making small changes. I started going for walks after work, just to get out of the apartment and clear my head. I dusted off my guitar, which had been sitting in the corner untouched for years, and began playing again, fumbling through chords until my fingers remembered what my mind had forgotten. I signed up for a class in something I'd always wanted to learn, photography. The first day, I was so nervous I almost didn't go, but I forced myself out the door, and by the end of the session, I felt a spark of that old excitement creeping back. The reunion was the real test. I was terrified to see everyone, afraid they'd judge me for how far I'd fallen. But when I walked into the room and saw their faces light up, all that fear melted away. They didn't care that I wasn't where I thought I'd be by now. They were just happy to see me, to laugh and reminisce and catch up on the years we'd missed. By the end of the night, I felt like a part of myself had been restored, a piece of the puzzle I didn't even realize was missing. It wasn't easy, rebuilding my life. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pull of my old habits felt almost too strong to resist. But every time I felt like slipping back, I thought about that photo, the one of me and my friends on the quad, and I remembered the person I used to be. She was still there, buried under years of neglect, but she wasn't gone. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like her again. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone I recognize, someone I'm proud of. It wasn't some grand, cinematic moment that changed everything. It was a series of small, deliberate choices, each one pulling me a little closer to the life I wanted. And it all started with that one night, that one moment of clarity, when I knew I had to change my life. I wasn't always the kind of person who understood the power of an apology. I was arrogant, sure of myself, and convinced I was always right. But everything changed on a fateful evening that will forever haunt my thoughts. It started innocently enough. I had just graduated high school and was eager to celebrate. My friends had organized a small get-together at Mark's house. He lived on the outskirts of town, in a cozy, creaky old place that seemed to breathe personality with its chipped paint and crooked shutters. Everyone was there, laughing and drinking, the kind of carefree joy only youth can muster. I felt invincible, the king of my own little world, and that's when I slipped into my old habits. Without a second thought, I began to criticize James, who'd brought his homemade pizza. I said it looked like roadkill, and my laughter reverberated through the room, careless and cruel. I could see the color drain from James's face as his smile faltered, but in my moment of glory, I chose to ignore it. The night wore on. After a few rounds of drinks, my bravado reached new heights. I belittled Mark's favorite band, made fun of Sarah's dance moves, and regaled the group with humiliating stories of people who had wronged me. It killed the vibe. You could feel the mood shift, the laughter faded into uneasy chuckles. I didn't care, though. I was having too much fun basking in my misplaced superiority. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, things took a strange turn. We decided to play a game called Gloom, which involved revealing your darkest secrets. The mood lightened briefly, laughter echoed through the room again, and I thought maybe I had redeemed myself. But that's when James spoke up. He could have chosen anything, but he leaned forward, voice low, and said he was going to share something he'd never told anyone before. The room fell silent, my heart raced. He started with a quivering voice, detailing a moment from when he was a child, a horrific event that left scars deeper than skin. He spoke about how he was bullied so badly that he'd faked a severe illness just to stay home from school, how he felt like a ghost in his own life, drifting in a world that loathed him. The room exuded a heavy tension, a collective gasp, when James mentioned one particular night, how he had tried to reach out to friends for support and was met with nothing but laughter and mockery, people just like me. I felt myself becoming dizzy, shame creeping into my bones. Right then, I should have apologized. I should have taken a moment to acknowledge my wrongs and the pain I had inadvertently caused him. But instead, I laughed it off as a joke. It was a pathetic failure of unity, and I thought I could whisk it away with humor. I felt invincible again, but that was when everything spiraled. Mark, clearly disturbed by the turn of events, stood up and told me to shut up. He was right, I was the toxic one in the room. For a brief moment, silence enveloped us, but I dug my heels in, harder, refusing to admit culpability. And that's when the lights flickered. It was a brief flicker, but enough to instigate panic. And one by one, those soft shadows of laughter receded, leaving only the ghost of our voices behind. The atmosphere shifted, solidified. When the lights returned, Mark was staring at me with disgust, and James, quite the contrary, had tears streaming down his face. "Why can't you see how much you hurt people?" he said through clenched teeth, raw pain bleeding through his stoicism. In that moment, it felt as though the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. I didn't respond, my mouth was dry, my heart hammered painfully against my ribs. I knew I should apologize, but my pride clung to me like ivy, wrapping around my throat, squeezing with every breath I took. Instead, I fled the scene. I didn't realize then how cowardly it was. I left my friends, left Mark and James behind, too ashamed to show my face. But that night haunted me. I couldn't sleep, replaying those moments of shallow arrogance in my mind. I could still see James's broken expression, and each time I shut my eyes, I saw his pain magnified, etched into my memory. Days rolled into weeks, and I found myself increasingly isolated. My friends treated me differently, and I felt the weight of their disappointment. One day, as I sat alone in a diner nursing a soda, I overheard two girls talking about their recent experience with a popular social media star who had made a public apology for their behavior. They discussed how powerful and pivotal it was, how it resonated within them, reminding them of the gravity of words. That's when it hit me like a thunderclap. An apology wasn't just words, it was an act of humility, a bridge to understanding, a step towards redemption. I had been given the opportunity to connect, to mend, but my foolish pride had caused a rift. That evening, I decided to correct my mistakes. I arrived at Mark's house with a heavy heart and a trembling hand, my mind racing as I knocked on the door. Mark opened it hesitantly, suspicion etched across his brow. My heart thudded painfully against my chest. I swallowed hard, struggling for words. "I'm sorry," I said, voice cracking. "I was a jerk, and I hurt James. I didn't see how far I'd gone, and I regret it more than you know." Mark's gaze softened for a flicker of a second, but still, he hesitated. "He's not ready to talk to you," he said finally. I could feel myself retreating but pressed on. "Please. Can you tell him I want to apologize? I'll take responsibility for my words." I stumbled through the evening, feeling like a ghost in that familiar space. A small part of me feared this wouldn't reach James, that I'd somehow bungle this, but I was desperate to make things right. Mark left me standing there quietly, and the minutes stretched into what felt like hours until my phone buzzed. It was a message from James, asking me to meet him at the park the next day, a place that once smushed our friendship. I felt sick, nervous energy swirling around my stomach, but this was my chance. The next day, under a canopy of trees, I found him sitting on a bench, time draping heavy over us. I walked over slowly, every step reverberating with the weight of unspoken words. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, his eyes not meeting mine. I swallowed hard. "I was awful to you, James. I made a fool of myself. I thought I could just laugh it off, but I see how wrong that was. I didn't know I was hurting you." He let out a slow, shaky breath. "I just want you to understand that words can cut deeper than knives. I've spent years wrestling with that pain you caused." I felt the lump in my throat grow, the heat of shame flooding back. Apologies had to be more than promises, they had to be understood. "I understand now," I said, emotions bearing down on me. "And I can't take back my words, but I want to learn. I want you to know that you deserve kindness." It was a small victory, the kind you win through vulnerability and regret. In that exchange, we learned something together. As we talked more, the shadows began to recede, we immersed in each other's lives once again. And that's how I learned the power of an apology, how it can heal wounds and mend broken bonds. It was a lesson in humility I would carry with me forever, and as I walked away from that park, I felt lighter, no longer shackled by the chains of my past arrogance. I never expected my life to take a turn like this. It all started on a chill October evening, the kind where the cold seeps into your bones, and the leaves whirl about in an eerie dance. I had just returned to my hometown after 5 long years, trying to escape the glaring reminders of a painful breakup. In my mind, the memories of Sarah lingered like ghosts in the empty rooms of my old childhood house. We were once inseparable, but life had other plans. She found love with someone else while I spiraled into a haze of loneliness and regret. On that fateful evening, feeling raw yet alive, I decided to drown my sorrows at the old bar down the road. It was a local dive, dimly lit with flickering neon signs and a jukebox that only played the saddest love songs. I ordered a whiskey and tried to ignore the knot in my stomach, reminiscing about the last time I was there with Sarah. Just as I took that first sip, an attractive woman entered the bar, her laughter bubbling like champagne. Her name was Mia, and she had an aura that drew everyone towards her. For a moment, I forgot about my heartache. We struck up a conversation, and I discovered she had just moved back to town, too, seeking something she couldn't quite put into words. The connection was instantaneous, a jolt that lit up the gloomy bar like a flickering flame. We laughed and shared stories, both desperate to shake off the weight of our respective pasts. After an hour, I realized I had stopped thinking about Sarah, and it felt liberating. The night twisted and turned, and Mia and I ended up outside, beneath an expansive sky littered with stars. In that moment, I glimpsed a sliver of hope, the potential for a second chance at love, and it filled the empty spaces within me. We exchanged numbers, and I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine as she held my gaze. The days turned into a carefree whirlwind of coffee dates, midnight strolls, and laughter that echoed around me like a sweet melody. I felt alive again. I let my guard down, allowing myself to believe that maybe this was it, that maybe Mia was my second chance. But as the nights grew colder and the autumn leaves began to fall, little things started to feel off. Mia sometimes seemed distant, as if her mind wandered to places I couldn't follow. I brushed it off at first. Everyone has their demons, I told myself, but each day came with unsettling sighs and lingering silences that I tried to ignore. One evening, as we walked along the waterfront, I mustered up the courage to ask her what was bothering her. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something strange, almost sorrowful, before she spoke. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice a whisper against the backdrop of the lapping waves. It stung, but I didn't push her. I valued the moments we shared too much to let my insecurity push her further away. But I still had my doubts, something felt unfinished. That night, I had a dream about Sarah. It was surreal. We were back in our old neighborhood, sitting on the front porch where we used to spend our summer nights. She looked just as beautiful as I remembered, her laughter washed over me in waves of nostalgia. But something felt off. As I reached out to touch her hand, she faded away like smoke on the wind, leaving an empty void that swallowed me whole. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the traces of guilt gnawing at me. I needed closure. So, one evening, I found myself at the old cafe where Sarah used to work. The smell of coffee hooked me, and I ordered a cappuccino, scanning the familiar room filled with echoes of sweet memories. When I turned around, I saw her. Sarah, clad in earthy tones, looked just as enchanting as she did 5 years ago, her eyes carrying a depth I had never noticed before. A cascade of emotions surged inside me, drawing me closer, and before I could stop myself, I approached her. Our conversation flowed like water, memories intertwining, and for the first time since the breakup, I felt at peace. It was bittersweet, yet liberating, and I left the cafe with the echoes of our conversation wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I couldn't help but think of Mia and the connection we had forged. When I returned home, I picked up my phone, hoping to call Mia and share the afternoon with her, but before I could press dial, I saw a text message come through. It was from Mia. The words made my heart drop. "Hey, can we talk? I don't think we can see each other anymore. There's something I haven't told you." The world around me began to spin, and I felt a chill slither down my spine. I replied, asking if we could meet in person. As the time trudged forward, I paced back and forth, replaying moments in my mind, trying to ascertain what could be the cause of her sudden retreat. Was I too enthusiastic? Did I scare her away? When I finally saw her, her expression was grave, her eyes filled with twisting shadows. We sat on a bench by the park, eerily illuminated by the dying light of twilight. "I have to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not who you think I am." Confusion mingled with dread as she continued. "You see, I've been trying to escape. Escape from a past that continuously haunts me. A tragic accident claimed my life, but I was given a second chance to return, to live again." Her voice broke, and I felt the gravity of her words envelop me. This was unreal, yet the sincerity in her eyes mirrored the raw pain I had felt in my heart. "And the only reason I found my way to you is to say goodbye. Someone wants me back." Panic twisted my insides. There it was again, that feeling of something lurking in the shadows, something unseen but achingly present. I wanted to defend her, wanted to shield this light I had come to cherish. "You're not leaving me," I hissed. "This isn't the end." But Mia soon faded like a wisp of smoke, revealing the truth I dared not confront. She belonged to a realm beyond my understanding. My heart felt fractured, a tug-of-war between the past I had tried to escape and the glorious present I had finally embraced. In that moment, I realized I had a choice. I could succumb to despair or seize the fleeting moments we had shared, honoring her existence instead of wallowing in grief. I chose the latter, whispering a promise into the chilly air, a promise to remember, to cherish, and to carry her spirit within me. As daylight faded into darkness, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. Mia's laughter echoed like a soft serenade, and though she was gone, I knew she had given me something invaluable, a second chance at love, a reminder of the beauty and fragility of life. I walked away from the bench, knowing I would never forget. Every time the leaves danced in the wind or the stars glimmered in the night, I'd remember her, the irreplaceable gift that life had given me, reminding me to love fiercely and live authentically. Because even in loss, there exists beauty, the chance to love again, to heal, and to keep the memories alive. It was a bleak winter evening when I stepped out of my apartment, the wind howling like a lost soul, and my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. I was on my way to meet a friend for dinner, just a casual outing to distract me from the monotony of my life. As I walked down the dimly lit street, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the shadows of a nearby alley. Curiosity tugged at me, and against my better judgment, I turned to investigate. Peering into the darkness, I spotted a figure crouched by a dumpster, shivering and wrapped in what looked like a tattered blanket. An unsettling feeling crept over me. It was that age-old internal struggle, should I help or just walk away? After all, I had a dinner to catch. But something about the scene pulled me in like a moth to a flame, and before I knew it, I was stepping closer. As I approached, the figure jolted up, revealing a young woman with wild eyes and tangled hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Please, I need help," she stammered, her voice shaky and desperate. I hesitated but couldn't bring myself to leave her there. I asked her what was wrong, and she explained that she had lost everything, her job, her home, and, terrifyingly, her family. The world felt heavy on her shoulders, and somehow, I could see it echoed in her blue eyes. I didn't have much to spare, but I offered her what little money I had in my pocket and asked if she wanted something warm to eat. She nodded with a grateful smile that melted my heart, and together, we walked to a nearby diner. Over steaming bowls of soup, we talked. She introduced herself as Clara, and I learned about her struggles, the suffocating weight of despair that had driven her to the streets. The more she spoke, the more I felt an unexplainable connection with her. As the evening wore on, I felt something shift in the air, an electricity of shared experience that made it feel as though fate had intertwined our lives, even if only for this singular moment. I had no idea what was coming next. After we finished our meal, I suggested that she stay with me for a night. I lived alone, and something in my gut told me that leaving her alone would be a mistake. Clara initially hesitated but eventually relented, though I could see the flicker of distrust in her eyes. Arriving at my apartment, I offered her a shower and some clothes I'd long outgrown. Watching her transform from a weary, beaten figure into someone who looked like they might actually smile again was the most beautiful thing I had witnessed in ages. We sat on my couch, and she shared more stories, about her dreams, her photography career that had crumbled under the pressures of life. As she spoke, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Sitting there, listening to her passion reignite, made me realize I hadn't truly felt alive in a long time. Hours slipped away as we exchanged laughter, fears, and insecurities. With each shared moment, Clara and I became something like friends, and with that connection, I moved from simply feeling pity to a strange, fierce desire to help her any way I could. I know it was irrational. After all, I had barely known her for a few hours. My instincts strongly warned against getting too close, that there was danger mingling with benevolence in this new situation. But my heart whispered otherwise. When we finally settled in and the adrenaline started to fade, I suggested the idea of a photography exhibition to Clara. Inspired by her stories, I thought it would be an incredible way for her to share her experiences and struggles. She lit up at the thought, her creative spirit reigniting before my very eyes. Just as we began planning the logistics, the laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence as we both felt the gravity of our lives. Around midnight, I offered Clara a couple of blankets and a place on my couch to sleep, feeling a wave of protectiveness wash over me as she nestled in, her face softening in a dreamlike expression. Once I turned off the lights, a wave of anxiety crashed over me. Here I was, letting a stranger stay in my apartment. But whatever unease gnawed at me was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose. I had to help her rise above the storm. Just as I was sealing myself away in my bedroom, I heard an unexpected rustle from the living room. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I rushed out, half expecting to find a thief or worse, only to find Clara standing by the window, staring out into the dark abyss of the street below. "I'm sorry," she said, startled, "I didn't mean to wake you." But there was something off about her demeanor, shadows flickering across her face, and as I moved closer, I realized she wasn't looking out at the street, she was staring reflexively into the darkness as if searching for something lurking beyond the veil. "What are you looking for?" I asked. She turned to face me, her eyes wide and haunting. "I don't know," she mumbled, her voice trembling. "I just have a feeling. I can feel it coming." That's when my heart stopped. I felt an inexplicable chill crawl up my spine, not from the cold outside, but something more sinister. I don't know what compelled me, but I grabbed her hand and quietly led her back to the couch, my instincts roaring at me to protect her. We sat there in silence, the tension thick between us, shadows lengthening in the dim light. But once again, she smiled, a small, fragile spark that lit up the room. I knew then that I wouldn't just let her go back to the streets anymore. I was invested in her journey, and in whatever strange bond had formed between us. As the night dragged on, we eventually settled into comfortable silence, a blanket of mutual understanding enveloping us, until sleep finally took us both. The next morning was bright and cold, but a warmth surged through me as I woke up to find Clara already awake, fiddling with her phone. I smiled, however, when she glanced at me and broke into a genuine smile. "I have an idea," she said, excitement dancing in her eyes. "Let's do more than just an exhibition, let's document the stories of people like me and share them. We could do a zine, and I'll take photos of everyone we meet." And just like that, the little project ignited into enthusiasm, a fire that burned bright against the fading memories of despair. Over the next few weeks, something miraculous happened. Clara and I became a team, exploring the city, meeting people, capturing their life stories, their hopes, dreams, and resilience. It was almost surreal, feeding their histories through her camera and into our collective being. Clara's zest for life was infectious, and soon, she became the artist she always wanted to be. I, too, was transformed. The darkness I had felt closeting away with my mundane routine dissipated in her presence. It became a life-changing experience, not just for Clara, but for myself as well. But just as life began to shine, an inescapable shadow began to loom over us. Cold breezes rustled through the air, and soon Clara became withdrawn again. I noticed her gazing out the window at odd hours, the same anxious look in her eyes. I did my best to reassure her, but our new routine was starting to make her restless. One evening, she burst into tears, pouring out her fears about revealing her past through the zine and how it might reflect on the people she cared for the most. "What if they hate me?" she cried. "What if they think I'm just that girl they always saw on the streets?" I held her close as the words drowned out the louder fears creeping inside me. Somehow, we made it through that dark patch, finishing the first issue of our zine. It was a heartfelt testament to struggle and triumph, and honestly, it went viral. We received testimonials from people encouraging us and even donations. I watched Clara flourish, her past fading from view as she emerged in the sunlight. But, just when it seemed the future could not be brighter, the storm returned. One night, Clara disappeared. I woke up with an odd feeling. The space beside me was cold and empty. Panic sparked in my chest, and I scoured the apartment, my heart thumping loudly in the deafening silence. The moments stretched indefinitely until I finally hit the street, scanning the area frantically. I had to find her, I had to bring her back. I retraced our footprints, every corner and shadow becoming haunted by her absence. After hours that felt like days, I received a frantic text. Clara had been spotted at the alley where I had first found her. It sent chills cascading down my spine. I rushed over, sweat pooling in my palms as shadows danced around me. When I finally stumbled into that alley, I called out her name, a broken whisper splitting the night air. I found her in the very same place we had first met, crouched against the grimy wall, her face streaked with tears. "Clara." I rushed forward, her eyes flaring with fear as she recoiled. "Please don't come closer," she begged. Me, her voice cracking. "I can't stay like this, it's taking over. I can feel it dragging me down again." Just like that old feeling from earlier, despair clawed back at us, vengeful and relentless, suffocating me. "You're not alone anymore," I pleaded, reaching out, but the shadows loomed too large, too intimidating. "You can't do this alone. But then she whispered something beneath her breath, a prayer or a mantra, and she abruptly turned away. I felt myself lunging, instinct driving me forward as I grabbed her wrist, pulling her back just as she was about to vanish into the darkness. "What are you doing?" I cried. "We can face this together." That was when I realized the dark shadow was not just a metaphor anymore. It was alive and vivid in her fear, a tangible darkness that threatened to consume her whole. "Let me go," she screamed. "You don't understand, it already has me." And for a moment, I felt the weight of that truth in my bones. The darkness that had haunted her had come for me as well. Fear fought within me, but holding her tight brought a surge of warmth, courage I hadn't known I possessed. "I won't let it win," I shouted, igniting a strength full of prayer. "Not now, not ever." Rolling waves of energy surged around as tears streamed down Clara's face, and in that moment, our connection glowed brighter than the doubt lurking in the streets. The shadows lurked, but we wouldn't let it consume us. It was an unshakable promise I made with every ounce of my being as I held on tightly, feeling her fight slowly begin to resonate again. And as if by some miracle, the darkness started to recede, retreating back into its corners as our laughter echoed through the alley. We did it together. We weren't just survivors, we were warriors battling the darkness, taking the first step toward the light. And from that day, we faced each struggle head-on, together. Clara's photography displayed at local galleries, her voice rising above the din that once silenced her. We became advocates for others like us, helping share stories that would brighten the faces of those still lost in darkness. If I had never stopped to help a stranger in need that cold winter night, I wouldn't have recognized life's infinite capacity for change. That night sparked a life-changing journey, one that grew into a meaningful tapestry of hope, light, and connection. In every moment, we breathed and created beauty where there was once only despair. And that's the time I helped a stranger in need. It changed everything. The moment I learned to say no without guilt began on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of night that seems to stretch on endlessly, where the weight of the week hangs heavy like damp laundry in my mind. I'd been sitting in my cluttered living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life that once felt vibrant but now seemed suffocating under the pressure of endless obligations and social expectations. My phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, a beacon calling me back into the gravitational pull of other people's demands. A message popped up from Jenny, my coworker, asking if I could cover her shift that Friday. My gut twisted at the thought of working late again. I had plans, you know? Plans that were supposed to be sacred. But I felt the familiar twinge of guilt creeping in, like a slick snake coiling around my conscience, squeezing until I could barely breathe. I replied with a feeble "I'll think about it," but deep down I knew what that meant. I was going to say yes. The following morning, I dragged myself into work, my heart heavy with the realization that I had agreed to juggle more than I could handle. I had always been the accommodating one, the yes person who believed that putting others first was the noble thing to do. But that day, something strange happened. As I sat in the staff break room, caffeine coursing through my veins like a dark cloud, I overheard two colleagues chatting animatedly about a book club they were starting, one that met every Thursday evening. My stomach lurched with a mix of envy and longing. How had I not heard about this before? Was I really so far removed from social circles that people simply forgot to invite me? All at once, I felt a surge of anger and sadness, both directed at myself. The two women didn't mean any harm, and yet, there I was, drowning in obligations, missing out on opportunities for connection because I kept saying yes to things I didn't really want to do. That night, I lay in bed tossing and turning, replaying the moments of the day like a broken record, when suddenly I was jolted awake around 3 a.m. by a faint whisper that rattled the stillness of my room. "Say no." The voice, soft yet firm, echoed in my mind like a mantra, intertwining with my thoughts. The word no felt strange, foreign even, like an uncharted territory I had never dared to explore. Over the next few days, I found myself ruminating on the idea. What if I practiced? What if I allowed myself the freedom to utter the word without guilt? My heart raced with anticipation as I approached my boss, who needed someone to organize the office party. Instead of immediately agreeing like I always did, I took a breath and said, "No, I can't take that on right now." He was taken aback, an unsettling silence filling the air. But then he nodded, as if he understood something profound about me had shifted. A weight lifted off my chest, and for the first time in ages, I felt a rush of exhilaration. The days turned into weeks. And I continued to wield my new skill with unexpected confidence. I learned to say no to the invitations I didn't want, the phone calls that drained my energy, and the commitments that filled my calendar to the brim. Each refusal felt like a small victory, an act of self-love that fortified my spirit. Then, one evening, as I lay curled up on my couch with a book, reveling in my solitude, I stumbled upon an old message from Jenny. She was asking me to support her in a charity event that required me to mobilize others, seek out donations, essentially, to be her right hand. Normally, I'd have leapt at the opportunity to prove my dedication. But, after a moment's hesitation, I typed a reply, "No, I can't do it." I pressed send with a mix of trepidation and triumph. For once, I prioritized my own needs over the expectations of others. But not everything changed as the days passed. There was a sinister undertow to my newfound empowerment, something I couldn't shake off. People started to view me differently, as if I had betrayed an unwritten code of support that had kept our social circles intact. With every refusal, I could sense the whispers behind my back, the sideways glances transformed into thinly veiled judgment. I felt the air grow colder in the break room, the laughter of coworkers diminishing whenever I entered. It unsettled me, yet there was a dark part of me that almost reveled in the newfound distance between myself and those who had once relied on me too heavily. But what began as liberation morphed into a loneliness I hadn't anticipated. One Friday afternoon, while I was at a local cafe, the door jingled as a group of my former friends walked in. They were laughing, vibrant, and, most notably, missing me. I watched as they settled into a booth, their smiles radiating warmth. My heart ached, a soft tug of regret pulling at me. I had liberated myself, but it had cost me a certain intimacy that felt irretrievable. Gathering my courage, I stood and made my way toward them, attempting to bridge the gap my nose had created. "Hey! Mind if I join you?" I asked, forcing a smile. Their chatter paused, and I felt their eyes scrutinizing me. One of them raised an eyebrow, and they exchanged glances that all but screamed exclusion. "Oh, sorry. We're just catching up. Maybe another time?" The words hit me harder than any rejection ever had, cutting through the lingering remnants of confidence I'd carried since asserting myself. I felt my cheeks flush, stammering out some half-hearted excuse as I backed away, making a fast retreat back to the cafe counter. I bought an overpriced pastry, the flavors bittersweet as they settled heavily in my stomach. The whispers of cruel laughter echoed in my mind, leaving me wondering if I had overstepped some invisible boundary. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced my dark apartment, feeling trapped between the rigid chains of guilt and the liberating yet isolating power of refusal. I was beginning to understand that saying no without guilt wasn't merely about decision-making, it was a delicate dance with consequences I had yet to fully grasp. My thoughts spiraled into paranoia, tainted by a creeping suspicion that my once spacious world was rapidly closing in around me. Days turned to weeks again, and those whispers seemed to gain volume, swirling in the corners of my mind until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Friends I hadn't alienated began to pull away, a series of texts went unanswered, and soon, I found myself stifling the urge to shake the ghosts of my old self to wakefulness. Then one evening, I found myself having dinner alone at a quiet corner table in a dimly lit restaurant, half-heartedly scrolling through my phone, wondering who might respond to my messages from last week, anything to break the deafening silence that enveloped me. As I sat there, a shadow fell over my table. I looked up slowly, meat fork poised midair, only to find Jenny staring down at me, her gaze piercing and intent. "We need to talk," she said flatly, urgency dripping from every word. I froze, heart pounding at the thought of engaging in a confrontation about my refusals. "I can't believe how you've acted. We used to be close, but now it's like you're a ghost. Do you even care?" Her words stung like icy daggers, cutting into my increasingly fragile confidence. I wanted to defend myself, to explain, to rationalize my newfound stance. Instead, I felt my voice slip away like sand between my fingers. I needed space, I managed, but it sounded weak even to my own ears. "Space is one thing," she shot back, "but isolation? That's a different story altogether." Looking around the bustling restaurant, I felt suffocated by the weight of her disappointment and the realization of what I had inadvertently cast aside in my quest for self-advocacy. Those bonds of trust that had once provided comfort now seemed frayed and tangled, and I was the architect of my own loneliness. As she walked away, I knew I had pushed too far, had swung the pendulum of my decisions too quickly to the other side. Even if I had learned to say no without guilt, I hadn't grasped the nuance of saying yes when it mattered. That night, the familiar darkness snuffed out any remaining flickers of hope. Days turned to months, and while I initially felt liberated by my newfound assertiveness, I eventually succumbed to the crushing reality that autonomy without connection was an arid desert. The lesson was harsh. Balance is not just about boundaries but about knowing when to blend in the colors of affirmation. It's a truth I still grapple with today. I learned I can say no without guilt, but I also need to remember that I am part of a community, a tapestry woven from interactions and relationships. To say yes sometimes isn't weakness, it's just being human. So now, I let myself choose. I embrace the quiet power of no while remembering to reach out, to connect. Life is a complicated web, and finding that balance is the most intricate and rewarding lesson of all. So here I stand, learning, growing, still very much a work in progress. If you find yourself at the edge of that cliff, wrestling with the urge to say yes or no, just remember, life is about building bridges, not walls. You don't have to be perfect, just be willing to understand the beauty of both choices. That's why I write this story, not to condemn the past but to embrace the duality of existence, a journey where no can coexist with yes without the burden of guilt. Embrace it, and you'll find a depth to your experiences that truly makes life worth living. I didn't always understand the importance of the journey, or how deeply personal transformation could shape someone's life. It started with a simple decision, to uproot myself from the monotony of my small town and move to the city for a job that, in retrospect, had been a mere mirage. I had this dream of becoming someone important, a small fish in a big pond rather than a big fish in a stagnant, muddy puddle. The first few weeks were exhilarating. I found myself enchanted by the city's pulsing energy, the thrumming of life at every corner, and the dizzying possibilities that seemed to swirl around me like a fog of inspiration. But soon, the excitement faded. The commute was brutal, my apartment was a shoebox of overpriced rent, and the job itself felt like an enormous weight pressing down on my chest. I spent my days in a sterile cubicle, staring at spreadsheets that seemed to grow teeth and devour my soul bit by bit. Late nights turned to early mornings, and I lost track of my sense of self as the grind consumed me. But something shifted within me when I stumbled upon an old bookstore tucked into a quiet alley during my lunch break one day. The moment I stepped inside, a world of forgotten stories enveloped me. The scent of ink and dusty pages was intoxicating. I felt something stir deep within, a yearning that had been buried under layers of stress and disillusion. That day, I bought a battered old journal, the pages yellowed with time. It became my anchor amid the chaos. Writing in that journal became my sanctuary. I poured out everything, my frustrations, my dreams, my fantasies of escaping the rat race. Each entry was raw and unfiltered, a cathartic release that chipped away at the isolation I felt. I started to explore what it meant to embrace my journey rather than resent it. Slowly, I learned to accept the job as a chapter, not the entire story. I found solace in this realization and decided to take small actions that would reignite my passion for life. I started meeting new people in coffee shops rather than the sterile lunchroom, learning about their dreams and fears, finding inspiration in their stories. I took ceramics classes on weekends, discovering how molding clay could be akin to shaping one's own existence. I began hiking in the nearby hills, letting nature's beauty seep into my bones. I began to realize that my life was not merely a series of obligations and duties. It was a treasure map, and each adventure could lead to a new discovery if I just dared to follow it. And then came the day that shattered everything I had built. I was standing at the bus stop, rain pouring around me, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in ages. They were in town and wanted to catch up. I hesitated, feeling an old fear bubble up. What if they found out I hadn't achieved all those lofty dreams we once shared? What if I disappointed them? But beneath that fear, there was a spark of excitement. In a split-second decision, I replied, agreeing to meet. We met at a cozy cafe, and my heart raced as I walked in. There they were, the same smiling face with laughter lines around their eyes, just a little older, a little wiser. We talked for hours, weaving tales from our past and hopes for the future. It was cathartic, a reminder that we were all in this journey together, each navigating our own paths. Just when I thought the night couldn't get any better, my friend mentioned a book that had profoundly changed their life, The Art of Happiness. How had I never heard of it before? That night, I ordered a copy online, and as I read it, it was as if the universe was aligning to show me what I had been missing. The lessons inside encouraged me to face my fears rather than hide from them, to find joy even in the mess of everything. With every chapter, I could feel my insides align, each word echoing a truth I had long buried under darkness. Inspired, I decided to start a blog, a public journal where I would share my journey, my struggles, and victories alike. Opening up my vulnerabilities didn't just feel liberating, it felt empowering. People began to resonate with my story. Strangers reached out, sharing their fears, their paths. My little blog morphed into a community of misfits, dreamers, and seekers all on their own journeys of transformation. It was exhilarating. I had finally learned to embrace my journey, the good, the bad, and the utterly confusing. I realized then that it wasn't the destination that truly mattered, it was the living, breathing moments that shaped my character and illuminated my path. Transformation is not a neat package, it is messy, full of detours, wrong turns, and beautiful moments that make you cry. But it's in that messiness that we truly discover who we are. So, here I stand now, a person radically transformed. I still have my struggles, some days, doubt creeps in, and the old fears threaten to smother my newfound light. But when that happens, I return to my journal, to the pages where my raw, unfiltered thoughts spill out. I remind myself of the small victories, the laughter shared over coffee, the friends I've made, and the community I've built. I have learned that transformation doesn't reflect a linear progression but rather a beautiful dance of trials and tribulations. That is how I embrace my journey, naked and unashamed. And if you're listening, I want you to know that whatever struggles you're facing right now, remember that a personal transformation doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in bustling city cafes, rain-soaked bus stops, or, like me, in the pages of a journal waiting for you to fill it with your story. So, embrace your journey, however messy and chaotic it may seem. Because what's waiting for you on the other side is unparalleled wisdom, growth, and a community that echoes your heart's unspoken desires. When I realized I needed to take a step back, it wasn't because I'd had a long day or felt overwhelmed with the demands of life. No, it was much more unsettling than that. It started like any other Tuesday, the sky a slate gray that threatened rain but never delivered. I was at my desk in my home office, buried beneath a mountain of paperwork, my phone buzzing incessantly with updates I didn't have the mental energy to address. I'd been working from home for what felt like an eternity, and in that sea of isolation, my mind started to drift into strange territories. I was dangerously aware of every creak and sigh of my house, it enveloped me like a familiar but suffocating blanket. Around noon, I decided to step outside for fresh air. I'd always wondered why they say fresh air clears the mind. For me, it only amplified the heaviness in my chest. The moment I closed the door behind me, I felt the world outside swallow me. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It felt like a vacuum, a disturbance in the fabric of reality. The air smelled stale, and an unsettling breeze whispered strange secrets I wasn't prepared to hear. It was at that moment I noticed a woman standing across the street, her back turned to me. She wore a long, flowing dress that seemed to flow with the wind, an odd choice for the chill that had settled in. I was struck by how she didn't seem to belong to the world around her, and a shiver crept down my spine as I squinted to see her better. She had long, dark hair that cascaded down her back like an inky waterfall, but there was something wrong about it. No wind stirred it, it hung eerily still. My curiosity kicked in, and I felt drawn to her. As I crossed the street to ask if she needed help, something strange happened. The moment I stepped forward, she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes two hollow voids that sent a jolt of fear straight to my core. I froze, my heart racing. She didn't speak, she just stared at me with eyes that held a darkness deeper than anything I had ever encountered. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something in her gaze anchored me in place, and I began to feel lost in her eyes, as if they were portals to some abyss I was not ready to confront. After what felt like an eternity, her mouth formed a smile, but it was devoid of warmth. It was the kind of smile that told me she was about to say something horrific, something that would shatter the fragile barrier between my perception of safety and the cold reality of what lurked just out of sight. I felt the ground beneath me shift, and suddenly I was no longer standing in my neighborhood. I was standing in darkness, surrounded by echoes of laughter that seemed to mock me. The weight of the world pressed down so hard on my chest that every breath felt like a struggle. I blinked, and the landscape morphed back into my street, the woman now gone, but the feeling remained. I rushed back indoors, locking the door behind me as though it could keep whatever horror I'd just witnessed at bay. But the sense of dread clung to me, defining the edges of my thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't relent. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, a side effect of too many hours spent alone. Yet, each minute that ticked by felt heavier than the last. My phone buzzed again, and with each notification, my heart raced, anticipating the image of her cropping up on my screen, or worse, the knowledge that she followed me inside. I decided I needed a distraction, so I did what I always do in moments like this. I pulled up social media. Scrolling through pictures of friends and familiar faces should have comforted me, but instead, it felt torturous, like I was trapped in a world that no longer belonged to me. Suddenly, I saw her again, in a video shared by a group I was part of. She was in a park, dancing under a full moon, her long hair flowing wildly as if the darkness itself were alive and keeping her company, but there was a collective unease in the comments below. The people in the video seemed entranced, their faces a mixture of bliss and terror. My stomach dropped as I read various users claiming she was a local urban legend, a spirit of the night who had been haunting their town for decades, luring the unsuspecting into her thrall. I instinctively felt the room start to close in on me, and the walls felt like they were breathing, pulsing with the same sinister energy I felt in that brief encounter. Panic set in, I could feel the walls of my own sanity begin to crumble. I shut my laptop, but the sensation to escape was overpowering. I paced back and forth in my living room, desperately trying to retreat into reason, but my mind traversed deeper still into the darkness that had unearthed itself inside my head. Sleep finally came hours later, but it did not relieve me. I was caught in a nightmare, trapped in a never-ending loop where I was compelled to confront her, again and again, in varied scenarios where she beckoned me closer. Each time, I awoke in a cold sweat, fully aware of what I needed to do. I had to take a step back from everything, the work, the distractions, the incessant noise of social media. I needed to find grounding, to become reacquainted with reality before whatever I had summoned turned into something truly horrifying. I turned everything off, the computer, the phone, the lights, and I sunk into the silence, allowing the real world to embrace me again. I found myself staring at the walls of my home, feeling the weight of their familiar presence, attempting to find solace in their solidity. But instead, I felt an undeniable pull to that emptiness outside, the woman who awaited me. I finally made the choice to confront her, to see if she had answers to questions gnawing at my sanity. Facing my fear seemed like the only way to reclaim myself from this creeping shadow. The decision both terrified and liberated me. I brushed aside my paranoia and stepped outside into the night, heart racing as I approached the spot where I last saw her. The streetlights flickered dimly, and an uneasy quiet settled around me, but I stood firm. I wouldn't let her consume me. After all, I was ready to take charge. The moment I rounded the corner into the park, it felt as if I had crossed into another realm. The atmosphere thickened, pressing in on me like molasses, stirring a terrifying sense of déjà vu. There she was again, the same haunting figure, twirling and weaving through the darkness as if calling to me. This time, though, there was a faint glimmer of resolve within me. I approached her slowly, defiance igniting an unfamiliar fire in my chest. Just as I opened my mouth to speak, I felt the entire universe shift around us. The trees whispered, the sky darkened further, and with a pained expression, she stopped dancing, turning to face me as though I had broken some wicked spell. In that moment, I saw not just the shadow of who she represented but the reflection of every fear I'd been running from. It was a darkness I couldn't ignore anymore. I would no longer allow that fear to consume me. I took a step forward, and immediately the energy shifted. Her hollow eyes seemed to soften, and for the briefest moment, I could see the sadness behind her facade. It was a moment of shared understanding, a recognition of our shared struggle. I didn't need to absorb her darkness, instead, I needed to take a step back, to reclaim my own light. The woman smiled at me for the first time, and with that simple gesture, the heaviness that had haunted me loosened its grip. I turned away from her and into the night, feeling every invisible weight lift as I walked toward the home I had lost touch with. I finally understood, sometimes, taking a step back isn't about retreating, it's about finding your way back to yourself.